Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, welcome back. Tonight we're going somewhere most history books prefer to ignore. We're stepping into the shadows of ancient Greece, into the quiet corners where young girls became mothers almost overnight, where every pregnancy was a gamble with death, and where survival itself was an act of extraordinary courage. Imagine this, you're 13 years old, maybe 14. You still play with dolls made of clay and scraps of fabric you giggle with. Your friends about silly things, you've barely started to understand your own body. And then one morning, your father tells you that in 3 days you will marry a man you've never met, a man who is 30 years old, maybe older. He has been chosen for you, and you have no say in the matter whatsoever. This was not some rare tragedy. This was normal. This was expected. This was motherhood in ancient Greece. Tonight we are beginning a journey through one of history's most overlooked stories. The story of mothers who were barely more than children themselves. Mothers who faced odds we can barely comprehend today. And mothers who somehow found the strength to love, to hope, and to survive in a world that seemed designed to break them. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the bride children of ancient Athens and the impossible weight they carried on shoulders far too young. The marriage age in ancient Greece was not a suggestion. It was not a guideline. It was law, custom, and religious obligation all rolled into one unbreakable rule. And that rule said this: a girl should marry within 4 or 5 years after puberty, which sounds almost reasonable until you realize what it meant in practice. Puberty typically began around age 12 or 13 in ancient Greece, sometimes even earlier due to the Mediterranean diet and climate. So 4 to 5 years after puberty meant most girls were married between 13 and 15 years old. Some were as young as 12. The poet Hesiod, writing around 700 years before the Common Era, laid it out plainly. He said it was good practice for women to be married off to older men just a few years after they reached physical maturity. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment. 13 years old. Think about the 13-year-old you know. Think about what they worry about, what they dream about, what they are capable of understanding. Now imagine telling them they're getting married next week to someone twice their age. The age gap was not just a few years. It was a chasm. Most men in ancient Athens married in their late 20s or early 30s. The typical age difference between husband and wife was 15 years, sometimes more. There were practical reasons for this, at least from the male perspective. Men needed time to establish themselves financially, to inherit property, to become citizens in the fullest sense. Women, on the other hand, were valued primarily for one thing: legitimate heirs. And there is the key word, legitimate. In the eyes of ancient Greek law and society, a woman's most important function was not to be educated, not to be happy, not even to be healthy. It was to guarantee the purity of the family bloodline. Her virginity before marriage and her fidelity after marriage were obsessions that drove the entire system. This is why girls were married so young. The thinking went like this: the younger the bride, the less chance. She had been corrupted by the outside world. The younger she was, the more easily she could be controlled and molded into the perfect wife. And the younger she started having children, the more children she could produce before her body gave out. Let me give you a real example. We know her name because it survived on her tombstone, which archaeologists discovered centuries later. Her name was Praxo. She was the wife of a man named Theocritus. Praxo was 21 years old when she died in childbirth. She left behind a 3-year-old daughter. Think about the mathematics of that story for a second. If Praxo had a 3-year-old when she died at 21, she gave birth to that child when she was 17 or 18. And if she followed the typical pattern, she probably married when she was around 14 or 15. Which means she spent most of her teenage years either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. She was still practically a child herself when she became a mother. And then motherhood killed her. Praxo was not unusual. There is another tombstone, another name, Canetha. She died from prolonged childbirth at 20 years old. The inscription says she was just barely experienced in life. 20 years old, and already the world had used her up. And another, Philotera, also 20, also dead from her second childbirth. Her epitaph is heartbreaking. It says her fame sings on as deep as her dear husband's endless grief. I wonder sometimes about that husband's grief. Did he grieve because he loved her as a person? Or did he grieve because he had lost his vessel for producing children? We will never know. But we do know that within a year or two, he probably married another teenage girl to replace her. These were not horror stories meant to shock people. These were just Tuesday. This was normal, expected. The cost of doing business in a society that treated women's bodies as state property. Now you might be wondering, did anyone think this was wrong? Did anyone speak up and say, hey, maybe we should not be marrying children to fully grown men? The answer is complicated. Some did recognize the danger. Some ancient physicians studying the bodies they saw noticed a clear pattern. They observed that girls who married and became pregnant very young were far more likely to die in childbirth. The medical texts that survive from ancient Greece occasionally mention this problem. They note that the female body is not fully developed at 13 or 14, that the pelvis is not wide enough, that pregnancy puts unbearable stress on a still-growing frame. But here is where it gets infuriating. Even when they knew this, even when the evidence was staring them in the face, most of Greek society just shrugged and kept doing it anyway. Because the political need for legitimate heirs outweighed the individual lives of girls. The state needed soldiers. Families needed sons to carry on the name and inherit property. That need trumped everything. Else there was one exception, and it is worth mentioning because it shows that an alternative was possible. Sparta. Now Sparta was weird in a lot of ways, and we should not romanticize it. But the Spartans did one thing that was remarkably sensible compared to the rest of Greece. They forbade girls from marrying before the age of 18.
Why?
Not because they suddenly discovered feminism or human rights. No, it was purely practical. Sparta needed warriors, strong, healthy warriors. And they figured out that if you want strong warriors, you need strong mothers who can survive childbirth and nurse their babies successfully. So they waited until women's bodies were more mature before throwing them into the pregnancy gauntlet. 18 is still young by modern standards, but it is a hell of a lot better than 13. And the data, what little survives, suggests it made a real difference. Spartan women were famous throughout the ancient world for being healthier, stronger, and more long-lived than their Athenian counterparts. They also had more legal rights and social freedom, though again, let us not pretend Sparta was some feminist utopia. It was still a slave society with brutal customs, but at least they were not marrying off children. Athens, on the other hand, stuck with the 13 to 15 range. And Athens was the cultural and political heart of classical Greece, the city we learn about in school, the birthplace of democracy. That word feels hollow when you remember that their democracy was built on the broken bodies of child brides. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like in practice. Because it is one thing to talk about numbers and ages in the abstract. It is another thing to imagine the real human experience. You're a girl named, let us call her Chloe, you're 13. You live in Athens around 400 years before the Common Era, which is the heart of what we call the classical period. Your father is a merchant. Moderately successful, not rich, but comfortable enough to afford a small house with a courtyard, a couple of slaves to help your mother with the work. You have spent your childhood learning the skills you will need as a wife, weaving, spinning, how to manage a household, how to be quiet and obedient. You've been educated, after a fashion. You can read and write a little, enough to keep household accounts. You know some poetry, some music, but your education focused mainly on making you a good wife and mother. That is your destiny. That is what you were born for. Your mother has tried to prepare you for what is coming. She has told you bits and pieces about marriage, about what husbands expect. But there is so much she cannot say because it is not considered proper to speak too openly about these things. So you go into your marriage with only the vaguest idea of what will be required of you. The man you are marrying is named Philippos. He is 29 years old. You have met him. About 10 minutes in the presence of both your fathers. He looked at you the way someone might examine a horse at the market, assessing, calculating. He did not speak to you directly. That would have been inappropriate. All the negotiations happened between the fathers. The dowry was agreed upon. The wedding date was set. And now here you are. It is a big affair, lots of ceremony and ritual. You're dressed in your finest clothes, your face painted, your hair arranged in an elaborate style that took hours. A husband had rights to his wife's body. That was just how it worked. And then, because biology does not care about your readiness or your feelings, you get pregnant. Maybe right away. Maybe it takes a few months. But it happens because that is the entire point of your existence in this society. You're 14 now, maybe still 13. Your body is changing in ways you barely understand. You're sick in the mornings, you're back home. Emotions are all over the place, which is confusing because you are also still going through the normal emotional chaos of adolescence. You're a child who is going to have a child. And you are terrified. Because here is what you know, even if nobody says it out loud, childbirth is one of the most dangerous things that will ever happen to you. You have seen it. Your mother survived, obviously, or you would not be here. But you have also seen or heard about women who did not survive. Maybe an aunt, a cousin, a neighbor. Maybe your mother had a sister who died that way. Maybe she had friends who died that way. The numbers are impossible to know precisely because ancient Greece did not keep the kind of detailed records we would need. But scholars have made estimates by comparing ancient societies to later pre-industrial societies where we do have better data. And the estimates are chilling. In societies without modern medicine, maternal mortality rates typically range from 25 to 30 deaths per 1,000 live births, sometimes higher. Let me translate that into odds you can understand. Every time you gave birth, you had about a 1 in 50 chance of dying. 1 in 50. That might not sound too bad at first. 98% survival rate, right? But remember, you're not giving birth once. You're giving birth 6, 7, 8 times or more over the course of your reproductive life. The odds start to stack up. It is like playing Russian roulette, except instead of 1 bullet in 6 chambers, you have 1 bullet in 50 chambers, but you have to pull the trigger 8 times, 9 times, 10 times. Eventually, probability catches up with a lot of women. And you're doing this starting at age 14 with a body that is not fully grown, with a pelvis that is not fully formed, which makes the odds even worse. I think about this sometimes, and it makes me angry. Not angry at the ancient Greeks specifically, but angry at the system, at the way. Societies throughout history have treated women's bodies as resources to be used up, as means to an end, as factories for producing children regardless of the cost. Because make no mistake, this system was not an accident. It was not some unfortunate side effect of ignorance. The Greeks knew what they were doing. They knew the risks. Some of their own medical texts spell it out clearly. And they decided it was worth it anyway. The needs of the state, the needs of the family line, the needs of individual men who wanted heirs. All of that was more important than the lives and well-being of girls. There is this concept in Greek philosophy which the Greeks invented and which we still reference today. The idea of virtue, of living according to reason and justice. The idea that a good society is one where people flourish and reach their full potential. But somehow that idea of human flourishing never quite extended to women. Somehow all those brilliant philosophers with their beautiful theories about justice and the good life looked at 13-year-old brides and saw nothing wrong. Aristotle, who is still taught in philosophy classes today, who wrote extensively about ethics and politics, also wrote that women were essentially defective men, that women were naturally inferior, lacking in rational capacity, designed by nature to be ruled by men. And he saw no contradiction between this belief and his theories about human excellence. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking when you really stop and think about it. But here is the thing. Despite the fear and the pain and the absolutely staggering injustice of their situation, these girls became mothers. They loved their children. They fought for their survival. They found ways to cope, to endure, to even find moments of joy. We know this because their voices survived, at least in fragments. Not many, because women were not encouraged to write, and most of what they did write has been lost. But we have some pieces, some poetry, some inscriptions, some prayers scratched onto tablets and left at temples. We have the words of Sophocles, one of the great playwrights who wrote, "Children are the anchors of a mother's life." He was describing a character, sure, but the line resonated because it reflected a truth that audiences recognized. Motherhood, for all its dangers and difficulties, was also the primary source of meaning and identity for women in that world. We have Euripides, another great playwright who wrote, "Love your mother, children. There is no love anywhere that could be sweeter than this." Again, a line that survived because it captured something real about the mother-child bond, even in a society that treated mothers as expendable. And we have the archaeological evidence. The tombstones, the offerings left at temples, the little clay figurines of mothers holding babies dedicated to the goddesses of childbirth. All of these things tell us that despite the system, despite the cruelty and the danger, love existed. Maternal love, the fierce, protective, tender love that mothers have felt for their children across every culture and every era of human history. That love is its own form of resistance. I think in a world that told women their only value was as baby-making machines, loving your children as whole human beings, fighting to keep them alive, grieving when they died, that was an assertion of humanity, a refusal to be reduced to a function, praxo. Who died at 21, left behind a 3-year-old daughter. I hope someone loved that little girl after her mother died. I hope she grew up knowing she'd been wanted, cherished, even if her mother's time with her was heartbreakingly brief. So that is where we are beginning this journey, with the bride children of ancient Greece, with girls who became wives and mothers before they were ready, in a system that valued their reproductive capacity over their lives. It is a dark starting point, I know. But it is important to understand this foundation because everything else we're going to explore grows out of it. The medical theories that justified early marriage, the religious rituals that helped women cope, the daily realities of pregnancy and childbirth, the choices mothers made to protect their children. All of it starts here, with a 13-year-old girl marrying a man twice her age and trying to survive what comes next. And here is what I find remarkable, what I find genuinely. They did survive, not all of them obviously. We have seen the tombstones, but enough of them. Enough to keep civilization going, enough to raise the next generation, enough to create the cultural legacy we still study today. That survival came at a terrible price, but it happened. And I think we owe it to those women, those girls, to tell their stories honestly, to not romanticize their suffering, but also to not erase it. To remember that behind every great civilization, every philosophical treatise and marble statue and epic poem, there were women giving birth in pain and fear and somehow finding the strength to love. Anyway, in our next part, we're going to dive into something even stranger and more disturbing. We're going to explore what ancient Greek doctors actually believed about women's bodies. We're going to talk about the infamous theory of the wandering womb, about why pregnancy was prescribed as medicine, and about how medical knowledge was twisted to serve political ends. It is a wild ride, and it is going to make you very glad you live in the 21st century. But it is also going to show us how powerful the need to control women's reproduction has always been, and how far societies will go to justify that control, even when it contradicts everything they claim to believe about reason and truth. So stay with me. We have a long road ahead, and there are many more stories to tell. Right then, if everything we have just explored left you shaking your head at the injustice of it all, get ready. Because what comes next is about to make you genuinely grateful to be alive in the 21st century. We have talked about the girls who were married off at 13 and 14, about the husbands twice their age, and the pressure to start producing children immediately. But we have not yet talked about why. Why did ancient Greek society push so hard for women to be pregnant as often as possible? What was the justification? What they actually believe was happening inside women's bodies that made pregnancy seem not just desirable but medically necessary? The answer involves a theory so bizarre, so wonderfully strange, that the first time I read about it I actually laughed out loud. And then I stopped laughing because I realized this absurd theory was used to control millions of women's lives for hundreds of years. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to the wandering womb. Here is what ancient Greek physicians, including some of the most celebrated medical minds of the ancient world, genuinely believed. They believed that a woman's uterus was not a fixed organ. It was not anchored in place the way the heart or the liver was. Instead, the uterus was, in their view, essentially a free-floating entity inside the female body, an organ with its own desires, its own needs, its own agenda. And if those needs were not met, the uterus would wander. It would drift upward through the body, pressing against other organs. It would migrate toward the liver, the lungs, the heart, even the throat. And wherever it went, it caused problems: pain, anxiety, convulsions, difficulty breathing, irrational instability. All manner of female ailments were attributed to this restless, wandering uterus. The medical term the Greeks used eventually gave us the modern word hysteria, from the Greek word hysta, meaning uterus. Hysterical behavior meant quite literally uterine behavior caused by a uterus that was not where it was supposed to be. Now, stop for a second and really sit with what this means. The ancient Greeks looked at the full complexity of women's emotional and physical lives, at their pain and their anxiety and their very real suffering in a society that marginalized them at every turn, and decided the explanation was their organs moving around inside them. That is impressive, honestly, in the worst possible way. But here is where it gets truly fascinating, because the Greeks also had a cure for this wandering womb. And that cure was, conveniently enough, exactly what husbands and fathers in the state wanted anyway. The cure was pregnancy. The logic went something like this. The uterus wandered because it was dry and empty. It was, in the Greek medical imagination, an organ with essentially an appetite. It craved moisture. It craved weight. It craved purpose. And the thing that satisfied all of those cravings simultaneously was a developing baby. A pregnancy would anchor the uterus firmly in place. The weight of the growing fetus would keep it from drifting. The moisture associated with pregnancy would quench its thirst. And the purpose of growing new life would give the uterus exactly what it needed to stay calm and stay put. Therefore, and here is the real punchline, a woman who was not pregnant was essentially a walking medical emergency. who was not regularly pregnant or at least regularly having intercourse with her husband was, by definition, medically at risk. Her uterus was wandering, her health was in danger, and the prescription was abundantly clear. She needed to be married, she needed to have regular relations with her husband, and she needed to be producing children. You can almost picture the physicians of ancient Athens congratulating themselves. They had managed to transform the social desire for women to marry young and produce lots of children into a medical imperative. It was not just good for society, it was actually good for women. It was medicine, and who could possibly argue with medicine? I find myself genuinely torn between admiration for the audacity of this and outrage at the consequences. Because as a piece of ideological engineering, it is extraordinarily effective. Take what you want anyway, dress it up in the language of health and science, and suddenly opposition becomes not just socially deviant but medically irresponsible. These ideas come primarily from the Hippocratic corpus, that enormous collection of medical texts associated with Hippocrates, the so-called father of Western medicine, written mostly in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. 7 of these texts focus specifically on gynecological topics, and reading them today is a genuinely strange experience because they swing between surprisingly sharp clinical observation and theories that make you blink. On one hand, the Hippocratic writers paid careful attention to women's bodies. They asked women about their experiences. They recorded symptoms diligently. There is one passage that has always struck me where the text essentially argues that physicians should listen closely to what women say about their own bodies because women are speaking from direct experience, and they probably understand what is happening inside them better than any outside observer can. That is honestly rather remarkable for 400 years before the Common Era. That kind of acknowledgement of patient knowledge is something modern medicine is only beginning to fully rediscover and respect. But then the same corpus gives you the wandering womb, the uterus as a semi-autonomous creature with its own desires and its own movement. The idea that women's bodies in ways that made women more volatile, more irrational, more in need of external guidance, and control. The texts describe women as having more porous flesh than men, more absorbent, more sponge-like in their exact terms. This is why women menstruate, the reasoning went. Their bodies soak up moisture from food and air, and that excess moisture has to be released regularly, and this same porousness explains why pregnancy is healthy for women. The growing baby absorbs some of that excess moisture, relieving internal pressure and making the woman healthier overall. You can follow the logic, even knowing the logic is completely wrong. They were trying to make sense of a body they did not fully understand using the tools of observation and reasoning available to them. The problem is that their observations were filtered through enormous cultural assumptions about what women were supposed to be and what role they were supposed to play. Let me give you a concrete example of how these theories played out in real women's lives. There was a condition called green sickness, what we would probably recognized today as a combination of iron deficiency anemia and general nutritional insufficiency that was extremely common among young women in ancient Greece. The symptoms were familiar: paleness, constant fatigue, breathlessness, loss of appetite, a general sense of weakness and fragility that did not seem to have an obvious cause. The Hippocratic explanation was that this happened because blood was accumulating in the blood vessels around the heart, unable to flow properly because it had nowhere productive to go, and their prescribed treatment was, predictably, marriage and pregnancy. The reasoning was that intercourse and conception would open up those vessels and allow normal circulation to resume. Breastfeeding afterward would help further by draining away excess blood, transforming it into milk. Now we know today what was actually happening. These young women were nutritionally deficient. They were growing rapidly, menstruating regularly, often not eating enough or not. The real solution was simply better nutrition, more iron-rich foods, more variety, more calories, things that were perfectly achievable in ancient Greece for families with adequate resources. But here is the frustrating part. The prescription of marriage and pregnancy was not entirely without some effect, which is precisely why the theory persisted. Pregnancy genuinely does alter iron absorption and blood volume in complex ways. Some women reported feeling better during pregnancy, at least temporarily, because their bodies were responding to a completely different hormonal environment. So the theory seemed to work, at least partially, at least sometimes, and that partial accidental success was enough to reinforce belief in it for centuries. This is how mistaken medical theories survive, not because they are entirely wrong, but because they are right just often enough that nobody has sufficient cause to discard them entirely. Here is something else: the Hippocratic texts prescribe for the wandering womb that is both grimly logical and revealing about how these physicians thought. They recommended that women with a suspected wandering womb be treated with smells. Pleasant smells applied to the lower body to draw the uterus back down to where it belonged, and unpleasant smells applied to the nose and mouth to repel it from the upper regions of the body. The uterus, in other words, was imagined as having something like a nose, something like preferences. It could be attracted and repelled like an animal that could be lured with bait or driven away with bad smells. Now, before you laugh too hard, consider this. The practice of using aromatic substances during labor, of holding strongly scented materials near a laboring woman's face, persisted in various forms for a very long time, and we now know that certain strong aromas genuinely can affect the nervous system, can alter breathing patterns, can provide a focal point that helps with pain management. So again, wrong theory, but not entirely wrong practice. But the underlying image, the uterus as a wandering animal inside a woman's body, capable of being herded back into position with the right combination of smells, tells us something profound about how the male medical establishment of ancient Greece fundamentally conceptualized the female body. Not as a coherent, self-governing system, but as something essentially ungovernable, something requiring constant external management and intervention, something that left to its own devices would cause chaos. Does that remind you of anything? Does that sound at all like the general attitude toward women in ancient Greek society? It should, because the medical theory was not separate from the social theory. They were the same theory expressed in different vocabularies. Now, you might be wondering, did any women push back on this? Did anyone say, "This is not how bodies work. This does not match what I am actually experiencing"? Almost certainly yes. The same Hippocratic corpus that contains the wandering womb theory also contains that passage acknowledging that women understand their own bodies. And we know that midwives and female healers had accumulated enormous practical knowledge about women's health that frequently contradicted what male physicians were writing in their texts. There is a legendary figure named Agnotis who appears in ancient sources, though scholars continue to debate whether she was a real historical person or a symbolic story. The account says she disguised herself as a man to study medicine in Alexandria because women were barred from attending medical schools. She then practiced medicine in secret, revealing her true identity only to her female patients, who had been refusing treatment from male doctors out of modesty and discomfort. When she was eventually discovered and brought to trial for practicing medicine without proper authorization, her female patients appeared in court and testified on her behalf so forcefully that she was acquitted. Whether Agnotis was real or legendary, the story itself tells us something important. Women wanted female practitioners. Women recognized that male doctors, despite their elaborate theories and their prestigious texts, were missing something fundamental. There was knowledge that lived in the bodies and experiences of women that the official medical establishment simply could not access from the outside. But that knowledge was not validated. It was not written down in the texts that survived. It was not taught in the institutions that mattered. It lived instead in whispered conversations, in the practices of midwives, in the collective memory of women who'd been through these experiences themselves and who helped each other through them. And here is what I keep returning to, the thing that I find most disturbing about the wandering womb theory. It is not that ancient Greeks had wrong ideas about medicine. Every era has wrong ideas about medicine. That is just the nature of knowledge advancing slowly through accumulated error and correction. What is disturbing is the direction of the errors. Every single wrong idea in the Hippocratic texts about women's bodies landed in the same place. Women need to be married. Women need to be kept pregnant. Women need to be under male supervision for their own health and safety. Whatever the symptom, whatever the complaint, whatever the question, the answer always pointed back toward the same social arrangement, the arrangement that happened to benefit men. That is not coincidence. That is bias wearing a white coat. The physicians who wrote these texts were not villains. Most of them were probably genuinely trying to help their patients. But they were products of a deeply patriarchal society, and their scientific reasoning was inseparable from the assumptions of that society. They saw what they expected to see. Their theories confirmed what their culture already believed about women, and their culture used those theories to justify keeping women in a specific, controlled reproductive role. This is a pattern that did not end with ancient Greece. The history of medicine is full of moments where cultural assumptions about women shaped supposedly objective scientific conclusions. It happened with Victorian theories about female hysteria. It happened with 20th century dismissals of women's pain as psychosomatic. It is still happening today in documented ways: longer wait times for women in emergency rooms, conditions that disproportionately affect women being chronically underfunded and under-researched. The wandering womb is gone from medical textbooks, but the impulse that created it, the impulse to interpret women's bodies through the lens of what society wants women to be rather than what they actually are, that impulse has proven far more durable. There is one more piece of this that I want to leave you with. Before we move forward, something that I think is genuinely hopeful in the middle of all this frustration. Despite everything, despite the wandering womb theory and the Hippocratic texts and the physicians who prescribed pregnancy as medicine for every female ailment imaginable, despite all of that institutional medical authority being arrayed against them, women found ways to retain knowledge and agency within the system. The midwives kept practicing, the female healers kept mixing their herbs, and attending births and passing down what they knew. The women who went through pregnancy and childbirth kept talking to each other, kept sharing what their bodies had taught them through direct experience. And that knowledge, that woman-to-woman transmission of embodied understanding, was in many ways more accurate and more useful than anything the male physicians were writing in their celebrated texts. Because here is the thing about the wandering womb theory. It was elaborately wrong in its explanation, but the women who lived in those bodies, who felt those contractions and nursed those babies and experienced every physical reality the theory was trying to describe, they knew things the physicians did not. They always did. The theory of the wandering womb told women their bodies were ungovernable without male intervention. But the real story of ancient Greek motherhood is the story of women governing themselves in secret, in community, in defiance of a system that preferred they believed themselves incapable of doing exactly that. That is the thread we're going to keep following as we move deeper into this story. Quantities. In our next part, we're going to talk about numbers, not ages this time, but quantities, about what it actually meant to be expected to have 6, 7, 8 children over the course of 20 years, about the physical reality of a reproductive marathon that never seemed to be expected to have 6, 7, 8 children over the course of 20 years. Made. So settle in because the numbers are about to get very real. We have talked about the age at which girls became mothers, about the 13-year-old brides married off to men twice their age. We have looked at the tombstones and the names and the heartbreaking mathematics of lives cut short. But now we need to talk about something else, something that might be even harder to wrap your modern mind around. We need to talk about numbers, not ages this time, but quantities. Because becoming a mother in ancient Greece was not a one-time event. It was not even a 2-time or 3-time event. It was a decades-long marathon of pregnancy, childbirth, recovery, nursing, and then doing it all over again and again and again. 6 to 9 children, that was the average. Let that sink in for a moment. 6 to 9 births per woman over the course of her reproductive life. Some women had even more. And this was not because they particularly wanted large families, although I'm sure many loved their children deeply. No, this was about basic mathematics and the brutal realities of survival in the ancient world. You see, the problem was this. Not all of those children were going to make it, not even close. Here is a number that should shock you, even though you probably already suspect it. Infant mortality in ancient Greece is estimated to have been somewhere between 30 and 50%. Let me say that differently. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all babies born did not survive to adulthood. Many did not survive their first year. Some did not survive their first week. The causes were everywhere. Infections, diseases we can easily treat today, but which were death sentences back then, complications from premature birth, deformities, simple accidents, and yes, also exposure. We talked about that practice last time where fathers could choose to reject a newborn and have it left outside to die. That was another contributor to the staggering death toll among infants. So if you wanted to ensure that at least 2 or 3 of your children survived to adulthood, to carry on the family name, to take care of you in your old age, to inherit property, you needed to have a lot of children. It was a numbers game, pure and simple, and women's bodies were the playing field. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If you married at 14 and had your first child at 15, and if you had 6 children total spaced roughly 2 to 3 years apart, you were looking at a reproductive career that lasted 14 to 21 years. That is most of your youth and all of your early adulthood spent in an endless cycle of pregnancy and nursing. Actually, let me be more specific about the timeline because the spacing of births was not random. It was determined largely by one factor: breastfeeding. In ancient Greece, women typically nursed their babies for 2 to 3 years. This was not optional. There was no formula, no bottles. If you wanted your baby to survive, you fed it from your own body or you hired a wet nurse if you were wealthy enough, which most people were not. So 2 to 3 years of nursing per child was standard, And here is the interesting biological fact. Prolonged breastfeeding acts as a natural contraceptive. Not a perfect one, obviously, but when a woman is nursing frequently, her body often does not ovulate regularly. So there would typically be a gap of 2 to 3 years between births determined by how long the previous child was nursing. Do the math with me. 6 children with 2 to 3 years between each birth. That is 12 to 18 years of childbearing minimum, and that is if everything goes smoothly, which it often did not. If a baby died in infancy, which happened frequently, the mother might get pregnant again sooner because she was no longer nursing. So in practice, many women were pregnant or nursing pretty much continuously from their mid-teens until their mid-30s or beyond. I want you to imagine that for a second, really imagine it. You're 15 years old and you're pregnant for the first time. You give birth. You spend the next 2 or 3 years nursing that baby, watching it grow, hoping desperately that it survives. And then, just as that child is being weaned, you get pregnant again. And the cycle starts over. You're 18 now, pregnant with your second child. You give birth, 2 more years of nursing, pregnant again at 20, birth at 21, nursing until 23 or 24, pregnant again. And on it goes. You're 26, 27, 28, still pregnant, still nursing, still recovering. Your body never gets a break. Your bones are leaching calcium to feed your babies. Your iron levels are constantly depleted. You're tired all the time. Bone deep tired because you are growing humans inside you or feeding them from your body year after year after year. By the time you're in your early 30s, if you have survived. This long you might finally be done. Your youngest child is weaned. Down might not be capable of another pregnancy, even if you wanted one. Or maybe your husband decides he has enough heirs and leaves you alone. Or maybe you are one of the women who keeps having babies into your late 30s or early 40s because biology does not care about your fatigue. There is evidence, by the way, that some women in ancient Greece did give birth well into what we would now call advanced maternal age. The medical texts mention it. Tombstones record it. Women having their final child at 38, 40, even older. Remember, if you had 6 or 7 children spaced 2 to 3 years apart, and you started at 15, your last birth might not be until you were 35 or beyond. And every single one of those pregnancies was another roll of the dice. Another 1 in 50 chance that this would be the birth that killed you. Now you might be wondering, did anyone think this was excessive? Did anyone look at this system and say, maybe we should not be putting women through this? The answer is complicated, as it usually is with history. Some people definitely recognize the physical toll. The medical writers, the Hippocratic texts that have survived, they talk about the damage that repeated pregnancy does to a woman's body. They describe conditions that we would now recognize as severe anemia, bone loss, pelvic floor damage, all the things that happen when a body is used for reproduction over and over without adequate time to recover. But here is the thing. The same medical texts that describe these problems also prescribe pregnancy as a cure for other ailments. We're going to talk more about that bizarre logic in a moment. But the point is, even when they saw the damage, they considered it acceptable, necessary even, because the alternative, a society where women had fewer children, was unthinkable. You have to understand demographic reality they were facing. Ancient Greece did not have the population stability we take for granted today. Death was everywhere. Childhood diseases, wars, famines, accidents. The average life expectancy for adults who survived childhood was somewhere in the late 30s to early 40s. And pulling the number down, in childbirth and pulling the number down. If you were a man and you did not die in war or from disease, you might live into your 60s or even 70s. We have records of philosophers and politicians living to old age. But if you were a woman, your odds were much worse because of the childbirth factor. So from the perspective of the city-state, from the perspective of maintaining population, you needed women to have a lot of babies. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was cold, brutal calculation. The society needed workers, soldiers, citizens, and the only way to get them was through women's bodies. But that does not make it okay. I want to be clear about that. Understanding the logic behind a system is not the same as excusing it. The fact that ancient Greek society needed high birth rates to survive does not change the fact that individual women suffered and died to make that happen. Their pain was real, their fear was real, and they had no choice in the matter. Let me tell you about a woman whose story was preserved in an unusual way. We do not know her name, unfortunately, which is typical. Most women in ancient Greece were not considered important enough to be named in historical records. But we have a fragment of her life anyway, recorded in a medical case study from the Hippocratic corpus. This woman had given birth 7 times, 7 children. The text describes her condition after her seventh birth, and it is not pretty. She was experiencing severe abdominal pain, weakness, and what sounds like a uterine prolapse, where the uterus actually descends or partially comes out of the body due to damaged pelvic floor muscles. This is a complication that can happen after multiple births, especially if the births are close together and the body does not have time to heal properly. The physician who wrote about her case describes various treatments he tried. None of them worked particularly well because this was ancient Greece, and they did not exactly have surgical options or physical therapy or any of the things we would use today to treat this condition. The text ends without telling us what happened to her. Did she recover? Did she live with chronic pain for the rest of her life? Did she die from complications? We do not know. But what strikes me about this case is how matter-of-fact the physician sounds. He is not shocked by her condition. He is not outraged that a woman's body has been damaged this severely by 7 pregnancies. He just describes it clinically, like it is an interesting puzzle to solve, because to him, it probably was normal. He had probably seen dozens of women in similar conditions. This was just what happened when women fulfilled their biological and social duty. 7 children, and we do not even know if any of them survived to adulthood. Statistically, with infant mortality rates what they were, probably 3 or 4 of them died young. So she might have endured 7 pregnancies, 7 births, 7 recoveries, all the pain and risk and physical damage, and ended up with maybe 3 living children to show for it. Was it worth it? I'm not sure she was ever asked. Here's another thing that makes this whole situation even more intense. The women going through this reproductive marathon were not doing it in isolation. They were not lying in bed being pampered and taken care of. No, they were expected to keep running their households the entire time. Remember, in ancient Greek society, the household was the woman's domain. She was responsible for everything domestic, cooking, cleaning, managing slaves if the family had them, weaving cloth for clothing, making sure there was enough food stored for winter, keeping track of household finances. All of this continued whether she was pregnant or not. There are vase paintings from ancient Greece that show pregnant women working, grinding grain, drawing water from wells, weaving at looms. Their bellies are clearly visible in the artwork, but they are still working because the work did not stop just because you were growing a human inside you. And after the birth, after the brief recovery period, which we will talk about in more detail later, the same thing, back to work, except now you also have a baby to care for. And if you have older children, you have them to care for too, and the household still needs to be run. And your husband still expects his meals and his clean clothes and everything else. Is it any wonder that the average life expectancy for women was so much lower than for men? Their bodies were under constant stress, pregnancy stress, nursing stress, work stress. And unlike men, who at least got to leave the house and participate in public life and have social interactions and intellectual stimulation, women were confined to the domestic sphere. The same walls, the same rooms, the same endless tasks for decades. I think about the psychological toll of that sometimes. The isolation, the monotony, the physical exhaustion compounded by emotional exhaustion. And I think about the fact that these women did not have therapy or support groups, antidepressants or any of the mental health resources we have today. They just had to endure, to keep going, to survive. And many of them did, which is honestly remarkable. There is a line from Euripides, one of the great playwrights of ancient Athens, that I keep coming back to. He wrote, "I would rather stand 3 times in the front line of battle than bear 1 child." Now, Euripides was a man, so he never actually experienced childbirth. But he was also a perceptive observer of human nature, and his plays are full of complex, suffering female characters. And this line, which he puts in the mouth of a female character named Medea, was clearly meant to resonate with the audience. It was meant to acknowledge a truth that everyone knew but rarely spoke about. Childbirth was dangerous. Pregnancy was hard, and doing it 6 or 7 or 8 times over the course of 20 years was a form of warfare that women fought whether they wanted to or not. The comparison to battle is interesting, and it came up in ancient Greek culture more than once. There was a belief which some scholars think was more propaganda than actual practice, that women who died in childbirth were honored the same way that soldiers who died in battle were honored. The idea was that both were sacrificing themselves for the good of the state. Soldiers died defending the city. Mothers died producing the next generation of citizens. Except here is the thing. Most scholars now think this equivalence was more theoretical than real. When we look at the actual evidence, the actual funeral practices and epitaphs and public honors, women who died in childbirth were not actually given the same recognition as male war heroes. They might be mourned privately by their families. They might get a touching epitaph on their tombstone, but they were not given public funerals with processions and speeches. They were not celebrated as defenders of the state. They just died, and another young bride took their place, and the cycle continued. But despite all of this, despite the exhaustion and the danger and the sheer overwhelming nature of having 6 or 7 or 8 children, we have evidence that mothers loved their children deeply, fiercely, in ways that transcended the utilitarian logic of the system. We have lullabies that survived, fragments of songs that mothers sang to their babies. We have votive offerings left at temples, little clay figurines of mothers holding infants dedicated to the goddesses of childbirth as thanks for a safe delivery. We have the Homeric epics, where maternal love is portrayed as one of the most powerful forces in the world. Think about Thetis in the Iliad. She is the mother of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks. She is also a goddess, immortal and powerful. But when her son is going off to fight, when she knows he's going to die young, she weeps. She begs him to reconsider. She uses all her divine influence to try to protect him. And when he dies, her grief is so profound that it shakes the heavens. Or think about Hecuba, the queen of Troy, who stands on the walls of the city and begs her son Hector not to fight Achilles. She bares her breast to him, the breast that nursed him as a baby, pleads with him to remember her care and come back inside to safety. These are literary examples, sure, poetry, not documentary evidence, but they resonated with audiences because they reflected a reality that people recognized. Mothers loved their children. They fought to protect them. They grieved when they lost them, and they lost them so often. Can you imagine carrying a child for 9 months, going through the agony and danger of birth, nursing that baby for 2 or 3 years, watching them grow and learn to walk and talk, and then having them die from a fever or a disease or an accident, and knowing you would probably have to go through the whole thing again multiple times with the same risk of loss each time? The emotional resilience required to keep going, to keep loving, to keep hoping. I find it almost incomprehensible. There is a concept in psychology called anticipatory grief. It is when you start grieving a loss before it has actually happened because you know it is coming. I wonder if mothers in ancient Greece experienced something like that, if the knowledge that some of their children would probably die created a kind of preemptive, protective emotional distance. But I do not think it did, actually, or at least not completely, because the evidence we have suggests that when children died, mothers grieved genuinely and deeply. We have epitaphs where parents express profound sorrow over lost children. We have references in literature to mothers who never recovered from the death of a child. We have religious rituals specifically designed to help parents process that grief. So I think what happened was more complicated than simple emotional detachment. I think ancient Greek mothers knew the odds. They knew the risks. They knew they would probably lose some of their children, but they loved them anyway. They had to, because what is the alternative? To not love your own child because they might die. That is not how human hearts work. And maybe maternal love in the face of probable loss is its own kind of resistance. A refusal to let the brutal mathematics of survival turn you into a machine. An insistence on finding meaning and connection and joy even when the world seems designed to crush you. 6 to 9 children. 14 to 21 years of pregnancy and nursing. A 1 in 50 chance of death with every birth. These are the numbers. This is the framework. But inside that framework were individual women, making individual choices about how to survive, how to love, how to find moments of happiness in lives that were often short and hard. And you know what? They did find those moments. We know they did because humans are remarkably good at adapting, at finding joy even in difficult circumstances. The archaeological record shows us that ancient Greek women laughed and sang and celebrated and created art and raised their children with care. They were not just victims of a cruel system, although they were certainly that. They were also human beings living full, complex lives within the constraints they were given. In our next part, we're going to talk about what happened when things went wrong. We're going to dive deep into the actual experience of childbirth in ancient Greece, into the dangers women faced every single time they gave birth, into the staggering rates of maternal mortality and what caused them. We're going to talk about hemorrhages and infections and all the things that could kill a woman in the birthing room. It is going to be difficult, but it is important because we cannot understand the courage it took to keep going, to keep having children, without understanding what they were risking every single time. So stay with me. We're going deeper into the shadows, but we will find light there too. There is a moment that every pregnant woman in ancient Greece must have thought about, probably many times, probably in the middle of the night when she could not sleep, when The baby was kicking inside her and she was counting down the weeks until her body would have to do the impossible. She thought about the odds. 1 in 50, that was her chance of dying every time with every pregnancy. If you've never gambled with your life before, let me put this in perspective for you. Imagine someone hands you a bag with 50 marbles in it. 49 are white, 1 is black. They tell you that you have to reach in and pull out a marble. If you get white, you live. If get black, you die. Would you do it? Would you reach into that bag? Now imagine you have to do it 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, because that is how many children you're expected to have. Each time you reach into the bag, the odds reset. 49 white, 1 black. Pull a marble, hope you get lucky again. That was childbirth in ancient Greece. And there was no opting out, no way to say, actually, I would rather not take that risk today. Your body belonged to your husband, to you. Family to the state, and the state needed children. So you reached into the bag again and again and again. Let us talk about what happened when women pulled that black marble. The statistics we have are estimates, reconstructed from fragmentary evidence and comparisons with other pre-industrial societies, but the numbers are fairly consistent across different sources. In societies without modern medicine, maternal mortality rates typically range from 25 to 30 deaths per 1. Some scholars think it might have been even higher in ancient Greece, particularly for very young mothers whose bodies were not fully developed. 25 to 30 per 1,000. That is where we get the 1 in 50 figure. Actually, it might have been closer to 1 in 40 or 1 in 35 for teenage mothers. The exact number varies depending on which scholar you ask and what evidence they're using. But the bottom line is this: childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman would ever do, and she had to do it over and over. What killed them? That is the question that haunts me. Because if we are going to understand what these women faced, we need to know the specific ways their bodies failed them, or rather, the specific ways that ancient medicine failed their bodies. The biggest killer was probably hemorrhage, massive bleeding during or immediately after birth. This can happen for several reasons. Sometimes the placenta does not detach properly from the uterine wall. Sometimes the uterus does not contract back down after delivery the way it is supposed to, and blood just keeps pouring out. Sometimes there are tears in the birth canal that sever major blood vessels. In a modern hospital, if a woman starts hemorrhaging after birth, there are protocols. There are drugs that make the uterus contract. There are surgical procedures to repair damage. There are blood transfusions to replace what has been lost. In ancient Greece, there was none of that. If you started bleeding heavily, the midwife could try to massage your abdomen, try to get the uterus to contract manually. She could pack the birth canal with cloth to try to stop the bleeding. But if that did not work, there was nothing else to do except watch you bleed to death. And it was fast. Shockingly fast. You could go from giving birth successfully to dead in a matter of hours, sometimes less. There is an epitaph on a tombstone that describes this exact scenario. The inscription is written in the first person as if the dead woman is speaking. She says, "The unstoppable fury of the newborn infant took me bitter from my happy life, with fatal hemorrhage. I did not bring the child into the light by my labor pains, but it lies hidden in its mother's womb among the dead." Think about that last part. She died in childbirth and the baby died too, still inside her. A double tragedy, and the epitaph captures the suddenness of it, the violence. Unstoppable fury. Like a force of nature that sweeps you away before anyone can save you. The second major killer was infection. This is what medical historians call puerperal fever or childbed fever. It is an infection of the uterus and surrounding tissues that happens in the days or weeks after birth. And in the ancient world, it was incredibly common. Why? Because nobody understood germs. Nobody understood that you needed to keep things clean, that dirty hands and dirty. Instruments could introduce bacteria into a woman's body. Midwives delivered babies and then went straight to the next birth without washing their hands. Physicians, when they were involved at all, did the same. They would examine the birth canal with unwashed hands, sometimes hands that had just been dissecting a corpse or treating a patient with an infectious disease. We know about puerperal fever in ancient Greece because the Hippocratic texts describe it. They call it something else, but the symptoms are unmistakable: fever, chills, severe abdominal pain, foul-smelling discharge from the birth canal, rapid deterioration, death within a few days to a week. The physicians had no idea what caused it. They thought it had something to do with retained afterbirth or with bad humors in the body. They tried various treatments, herbally made things worse by weakening patients who were already fighting infection. Nothing worked, of course, because they were treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying cause. The bacteria was still there, multiplying, spreading through the bloodstream. Puerperal fever would not be understood or effectively treated until the mid-1800s, when a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis figured out that doctors were spreading it by not washing their hands. Even then, his discovery was ridiculed and rejected for years. So imagine how helpless ancient Greek physicians must have felt watching women die from something they could not explain and could not stop. There were other causes of maternal death too. Eclampsia, which is severe high blood pressure during pregnancy that can cause seizures. The Hippocratic texts mention this condition, describing women who suddenly start having convulsions during or after labor. They had no treatment for it. If you developed eclampsia in ancient Greece, your chances of survival were basically down to luck. There was also exhaustion, labors that went on for days, literally, with the woman pushing and straining until her body just gave out. This was especially common with first births, when the birth canal had never been stretched before, or with births where the baby was positioned wrong. A baby coming out feet first or sideways instead of head first could mean a labor that lasted 40, 50, 60 hours. Can you imagine that? Contractions for 2.5 days straight. No pain relief, no epidural, just hour after hour of agony until finally. Sometimes it was the baby that died from lack of oxygen. Sometimes it was the mother who died from sheer physical collapse. And there was no cesarean section option. Well, that is not quite true. The Romans did perform cesarean sections, but only on women who had already died, to try to save the baby. The idea of cutting into a living woman's abdomen was considered impossible. The woman would bleed to death or die from infection, which is true without anesthesia and antiseptic. Technique. So if a baby was stuck and could not be delivered normally, the choices were grim. You could try various manipulations to turn the baby. You could try to crush the baby's skull and remove it in pieces to save the mother, which is as horrific as it sounds. Or you could just wait and hope, and usually both mother and baby died. The helplessness of it all is what gets me. These were not stupid people. Ancient Greek physicians were skilled and knowledgeable in many ways. They understood anatomy reasonably well. They had sophisticated theories about how the body worked, but when it came to saving women in childbirth, when it really mattered, they were almost useless. They could offer comfort, they could try a few interventions, but mostly they just watched and prayed. Speaking of prayer, let us talk about what women actually did to try to improve their odds. Because they were not passive in the face of these dangers. They sought help wherever they could find it. And when medicine could not save you, you turned to the gods. Every pregnant woman in ancient Greece would have prayed to the goddess Eileithyia. She was the goddess of childbirth, specifically the one you called on when labor started. Women would make vows to her. If you help me survive this birth, I will dedicate my best cloak to you. If you protect my baby, I will sacrifice a sheep in your honor. We know about these vows because some of them were recorded on stone tablets left at temples. We also know about them because of the archaeological evidence. Remember those belt clasps and clothing pins we talked about earlier? The ones that survive because the cloth has disintegrated but the metal fasteners remain. 84% of those found at religious sites were dedicated to female deities, most of them to Eileithyia, Artemis or Hera, goddesses associated with women, marriage and childbirth. The belt clasps are particularly interesting because they relate to a specific ritual. During childbirth, a woman would loosen her belt or girdle, symbolically loosening her womb to let the baby come out. After a successful birth, she would dedicate that belt to the goddess as thanks. So all those metal clasps represent all those women who survived, all those prayers that were answered, or at least appeared to be. But what about the prayers that were not answered? The women who called on Eileithyia and Artemis and Hera and still died anyway. We do not have their belt clasps. We have their tombstones instead. There is something deeply human about this, though, this need to believe that you have some control, some influence. Even in a situation that is fundamentally out of your hands, you cannot control whether you hemorrhage. You cannot control whether you develop an infection. You cannot control the position your baby is in or whether your pelvis is wide enough. But you can pray. You can make offerings. You can perform the rituals correctly and hope that the gods will look favorably on you. And maybe sometimes it helped. Not because the gods were real and actually intervening, although the ancient Greeks certainly believed they were, but because belief itself can be powerful. If you go into labor believing that Eileithyia is watching over you, that might help you stay calm. And staying calm might help your body relax, which might make the labor easier. It is not magic, it is just psychology. But in a situation where you have no other tools, psychology is something. There is also the communal aspect of it. When you dedicated your belt to the goddess after a successful birth, you were joining a community of women who had also survived. You were saying, I made it. I am one of the lucky ones. And when other pregnant women came to the temple and saw all those offerings, all those belts and pins and scraps of clothing, They saw evidence that survival was possible, that other women had been where they were and had lived to tell about it. That matters. That sense of being part of something larger than yourself, of being connected to all the women who came before you and all the women who will come after. It does not change the physical risks, but it might change how you face them. Let me tell you about one more epitaph because I think it captures something important about how these women thought about their deaths. Her name was Callisthene.
We know that much.
She died at age 22. The inscription on her tomb says, "Callisthene lie here, having perished in the pangs of hard childbirth. I left behind my husband's grief and my baby son. Weep for my fate, stranger, for youth and death came to me together. Youth and death came to me together." That line breaks my heart every time I read it, because she is right. She was 22. She should have had decades ahead of her. She should have watched her son grow up, should have had more children if she wanted them, should have grown old and become a grandmother. But instead, youth and death came together. Her life was cut off just as it was beginning. And yet, look at what she chooses to mention in her epitaph. Not anger at the gods, not rage at the unfairness of it all. She mentions her husband's grief and her baby son. Even in death, even in this permanent record of her existence, she is defined by her relationships, by the people she loved and who loved her. I don't know if that is beautiful or tragic. Maybe it is both. Here is what I keep coming. The thing that amazes me about these women, they knew the risks.
They absolutely knew. Every woman in ancient Greece had seen it happen.
Maybe to her mother, maybe to her sister, maybe to a friend or neighbor. They had all known women who died in childbirth. They had all been to funerals for young mothers. They had all heard the stories. And yet they still got pregnant. They still had children. Not because they were stupid or because they did not understand the danger, but because they had no real choice, and because even if you know intellectually that you might die, it is almost impossible to really believe it will happen to you. That is just how human psychology works. We all think we're going to be the ones who survive. 49 white marbles, 1 black. Reach into the bag and somehow convince yourself that you're going to pull out white this time too, just like you did last time. Even though the odds never change, even though every draw is independent and the marble does not care about your previous luck or your hopes or your unfinished life. Most of them did pull white marbles. Most births did not end in the mother's death. Remember, it was 1 in 50, which means 49 out of 50 times the woman survived. Those are pretty good odds, actually, in absolute terms. 98%. If someone offered you a medical procedure with a 98% survival rate today, you would probably take it. But here is the thing. You are not doing it once. You are doing it 6 times, 7 times, 8 times. And when you do something dangerous repeatedly, the risk compounds. If you have a 98% chance of survival with 1 birth, your chance of surviving all 6 births is actually more like 88%, still pretty good. But now 12% of women are dying somewhere along their reproductive career. That is more than 1 in 10. Those are much scarier odds, and this is assuming you have the average 98% chance. If you are very young, if you are malnourished, if you've had multiple previous births and your body is already damaged, your odds for each individual birth might be worse, maybe 95%, maybe 90%. And then the compound risk becomes much more significant. I think sometimes about the women who survived all of it. The ones who had 6 or 7 or 8 children and lived through every single birth. They made it to their late 30s or 40s, past the dangerous reproductive years, and suddenly they can breathe again. They had won the lottery. They had beaten the odds. Did they feel lucky, or did they feel like they had just survived a war? Because in a sense they had. They had spent 20 years on a battlefield where the enemy was their own biology and the prize for victory was just getting to keep existing. There is a fragment of poetry that might have been written by Sappho, though scholars debate the attribution. It says, "Some say an army of horsemen, some an army on foot, and some say a fleet of ships is the most beautiful thing on the black earth. But I say it is whatever one loves." I have always found that last line interesting in the context of motherhood, because for women in ancient Greece, what they loved was also what might kill them, their children. The act of bringing those children into the world. They loved them anyway. They chose to keep loving them, keep trying, keep hoping, even when every pregnancy was a gamble, even when the house always had an edge. That is a kind of courage that does not get talked about much. It is not the courage of a soldier charging into battle. It is quieter, more private, but it is courage nonetheless. The courage to keep going when you know you might not make it. The courage to love something even when that love might cost you everything. In our next part, we're going to shift focus a little bit. We're going to talk about what happened after the birth, assuming the we're going to explore one of the stranger customs in ancient Greek culture, the amphidromia ceremony, where fathers had the absolute power to decide whether a newborn baby would live or die. We're going to talk about the ritual of exposure, about why some babies were left outside to die, and about what that meant for mothers who had just risked their lives to bring those babies into the world. It is a dark topic, but it is essential to understanding the full picture of motherhood in ancient Greece, because survival was not just about making it through childbirth. It was also about what came after, so stay with me. We are not done yet. Picture this moment. You have just survived. Against odds that would terrify anyone today, you've made it through childbirth alive. The pain is subsiding. The midwife has cleaned the baby and wrapped it in strips of cloth. You are exhausted beyond anything you have ever felt before, but you are breathing. Your heart is beating. You survived the 1 in 50 gamble one more time, and now comes another moment. One that is somehow even crueler than everything you just endured. The baby is placed on the ground. Not in your arms, on the ground, and everyone waits. They wait for your husband to come into the room to look at what you have produced with your blood and pain and risk of death. And he makes a decision. A simple decision that will determine whether the baby you just birthed will live or die. He can pick it up, or he can walk away. If he picks it up, the baby is accepted into the family. It will be bathed in oil and water, properly swaddled, and in 10 days, if it survives that long, it will receive a name. But if he walks away, if he decides this baby is not worth keeping, then it will be taken outside the city walls and left on a hillside or at a crossroads, left to die of exposure, or to be picked up by strangers who might raise it as a slave, or who might do worse things. And you, the mother who just risked everything to bring this child into the world, have absolutely no say in the matter. None. Your opinion does not count. Your feelings do not matter. The baby's fate rests entirely in the hands of the man who was not even in the room when you almost died bringing it into existence. Welcome to the amphidromia. Welcome to the ritual that decided which babies got to become people. Let me be clear about something right from the start. This is one of those aspects of ancient Greek culture that is really hard for modern people to wrap their heads around. We are talking about a society that produced Socrates and Plato, that invented democracy and philosophy and theatre as a routine part of life. The amphidromia ceremony happened on the 10th day after birth. 10 days was the waiting period, the probationary period, because a lot of babies died in those first 10 days from complications of birth, from infections, from congenital problems that were not obvious immediately. So the Greeks waited. They did not name the baby. They did not fully acknowledge it as a member of the family. They just waited to see if it would survive. If the baby made it to day 10, that was considered a good sign. So that is when the formal acceptance ritual happened. The father would carry the baby around the household hearth, the sacred fire at the center of the home. He would walk in a circle, presenting the baby to the household gods. This is where the name amphidromia comes from. It means running around. He literally ran around the hearth with the baby. This ritual signified that the child was now officially part of the oikos, the household. It had an identity, it had a name. It had a place in the family structure and eventually, if it was a boy, a place in the larger civic community. But here is the catch. This only happened if the father decided to accept the baby in the first place, and there were a lot of reasons he might not. Baby girls were at much higher risk of rejection than baby boys. This should not surprise anyone, given what we already know about ancient Greek society. Sons were valuable. They could inherit property, carry on the family name, become citizens, fight in wars, take care of their parents in old age. Daughters, on the other hand, were expensive. You had to provide a dowry when they got married, which could be a significant financial burden, and then they left to become part of their husband's household, so you did not even get the benefit of their labor or support in your old age. So from a purely economic standpoint, which is how many ancient Greek fathers seem to have thought about it, daughters were a net loss. You invested resources in raising them and then had to pay someone to take them off your hands. Boys were an investment that paid dividends. Girls were a cost you had to bear. There are stories, whether true or exaggerated we do not know, of men who would not even go look at the baby. If they heard it was a girl, they would just tell the midwife to take it away, deal with it. They did not want to know it, because then it might be harder to make the cold, calculated decision to let it die. I cannot imagine what that must have felt like for the mothers. You have just spent 9 months growing this baby inside you. You have just gone through the agony and terror of childbirth. You have just gambled your life and won, and now you are lying. They're weak and exhausted while someone takes your daughter away because your husband decided she was not worth the cost of raising. Did mothers try to argue? Did they beg? Did they plead for their baby girls? I'm sure some did, But legally, socially, they had no power. The father's decision was absolute. And if you made too much of a fuss, you risked being seen as a bad wife, someone who did not understand the economic realities of running a household. It was not just girls who were at risk, though. Baby boys could also be rejected if there was something wrong with them, if they were born with obvious deformities or disabilities, if they seemed too weak or sickly, if the family already had several sons and could not afford to raise another one, if the father suspected, rightly or wrongly, that the child was not actually his. That last one is particularly cruel when you think about it. Remember, married women in ancient Greece were kept secluded, watched constantly, given very little freedom, precisely to prevent them from having affairs, and yet men still had this paranoia that their wives might cuckold them. So if a baby was born and the father decided it did not look like him, or if his family whispered doubts in his ear, he could refuse to accept it, and the baby would die, even though the mother had almost certainly been faithful, even though she had had no opportunity to be anything else. The practice of infant exposure was so common in ancient Greece that there are references to it everywhere in literature and legal texts. It was not hidden. It was not shameful. It was just normal. A practical solution to practical problems. Too many mouths to feed. Expose the baby. Another daughter when you already have one? Expose the baby. Birth defect. That means the child will never be a productive member of society. Expose the baby. The mechanics of it varied. Sometimes the baby would be left at a crossroads, a place where travelers passed frequently. The idea was that maybe someone would take pity and pick it up, raise it as their own, usually as a slave, but at least alive. Sometimes babies were left at temples or sanctuaries in hopes that the priests would care for them or find someone to adopt them. Sometimes they were just left in the wilderness, on a hillside or in a forest, where they would die of exposure within hours. And here is a detail that makes it even more horrifying. Exposure was not considered killing. Legally, morally, it was seen as completely different from outright infanticide. If you took a baby and smashed its head against a wall or smothered it, that was murder, and it was condemned. But if you just left it outside and let nature take its course, that was acceptable. You were not killing it. You were just declining to accept the responsibility of raising it. If it died, that was fate's decision, not yours. The mental gymnastics required to maintain that distinction are impressive in a really disturbing way. Now, before you start thinking that ancient Greeks were monsters, let me complicate the picture a little bit, because the reality is more nuanced than they casually murdered unwanted babies. First, we do not actually know how common exposure was. The ancient sources talk about it like it was normal practice. But ancient sources also tend to focus on the dramatic and unusual. We do not have statistics. We do not have precise numbers. Some scholars think exposure was relatively rare, only happening in extreme circumstances like severe disability or desperate poverty. Other scholars think it was quite common, especially for girls. The truth is probably somewhere in between and varied a lot, depending on the specific city-state, the time period, and the family's economic situation. A wealthy family might expose fewer children because they could afford to raise more. A poor family might expose more because they literally could not feed extra mouths. There is evidence that times of famine or war saw spikes in infant exposure because resources were scarce and survival was uncertain for everyone. Second, we have to remember that ancient Greeks were facing a demographic reality that is almost unimaginable to us today. Infant mortality was already so high that roughly half of children died before adulthood. Adding a few more deaths through exposure, while horrible from our perspective, was not radically changing the overall survival rate. These were people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. That does not make it okay. I'm not trying to excuse the practice, but I think we need to understand it in context rather than just judging them by modern moral standards and calling it a day. What I find most heartbreaking, though, is thinking about the mothers, because unlike the fathers, who could make a cold, rational decision about economics and family planning, the mothers had a physical and emotional connection to these babies that could not be erased by logic. You carried this baby for 9 months, you felt it move inside you. You talked to it, sang to it, imagined its future. You went through the terror of childbirth to bring it into the world. And now someone is telling you that all of that was pointless because your husband has decided this baby is not worth keeping. There is a play by Euripides called Ion, where a character describes a mother who exposed her infant son years earlier. The play portrays her as haunted by guilt, unable to forget what She did, desperate to know if the child somehow survived. Now, this is fiction, not documentary evidence, but Euripides was writing for an audience of Athenians who presumably recognized these emotions as realistic, which suggests that maternal guilt over exposure was real and acknowledged, even if the practice itself was legal and accepted. Did all mothers feel guilty? Probably not. People are capable of convincing themselves that what they did was necessary, especially when society tells them. It was the right decision. But I'm willing to bet that a lot of mothers struggled with it. A lot of mothers spent years wondering what happened to the baby they were forced to give up, whether it died quickly or suffered, whether some kind stranger found it and gave it a home, whether it was still out there somewhere, alive but lost to them forever. And here is another layer to this whole situation that makes it even more complicated. Some mothers, particularly unmarried mothers or women who'd been assaulted, might have actually wanted to expose their babies because keeping the baby would mean disgrace, poverty, being cast out by their families. In those cases, exposure might have seemed like the least bad option, a mercy, even, compared to trying to raise a child in impossible circumstances. So we cannot simply say that exposure was always something forced on unwilling mothers by heartless fathers. Sometimes mothers were complicit. Sometimes they were even the ones who made the decision. Human behavior is messy and complicated and does not fit neatly into victim and villain categories. But still, the image haunts me. A woman lying in bed, still bleeding from childbirth, watching someone carry her baby out of the room, not knowing if she will ever see it again, knowing probably that she will not, and having to just accept it, having to get up in a few days and go back to her normal life and pretend that nothing happened. How do you do that? How do you move on from that? I honestly do not know. Let me tell you about the tokens that parents used when they exposed babies, because this detail reveals something important about the psychology of it all. Often, when parents exposed an infant, they would leave some kind of token with it, a piece of jewelry, a small amulet, a strip of cloth with a particular pattern. The idea was that this token could serve as a form of identification. If by some miracle the child was found and raised by someone else, and if by an even greater miracle the biological parents somehow encountered that child later in life, the token would allow them to recognize each other. This practice shows up in Greek literature all the time. It is a common plot device in comedies and tragedies. Long-lost children recognized by their tokens, reunited with their birth parents, dramatic revelations about true identity. Obviously, in real life, these reunions were probably vanishingly rare, but the fact that people left tokens at all suggests that they wanted to believe it was possible. They wanted to believe that the story did not have to end with the baby dying alone on a hillside. It is a way of hedging your bets emotionally. You're giving up the baby, you're letting it go, but you're leaving a door open just a crack. Maybe, just maybe, this is not really goodbye forever. Maybe this is just a temporary separation forced by circumstances. Maybe someday, somehow, there will be recognition and reunion. It is heartbreaking in its hopefulness. This desperate desire to not fully let go even when you know you have to. There were people who capitalized on this practice, by the way. People who would go around to the known exposure sites, collect the babies that had been left there, and raise them to be slaves. It was a business model. Free labor that you just had to pick up off the ground and keep alive long enough to be useful. Some of these slave dealers would specifically look for babies with tokens because those babies were more likely to be from wealthy families, which meant there was a tiny chance that someday the birth parents might come looking, might be willing to pay to buy their child back. Probably not, but maybe. And in the meantime, you had a slave. This is one of those things that sounds so dystopian that you almost cannot believe it was real, but it was. The ancient sources mention it matter-of-factly. There were people whose job was collecting exposed infants. What did the mothers think about this possibility? Did it comfort them to know that their baby might be picked up and raised, even if as a slave? Or did it make things worse, knowing their child might be alive but in a situation they could never rescue them from? I would guess it varied. For some mothers, knowing the baby might survive was better than knowing it damnedly died. For others, the thought of their child living as a slave might have been worse than death. There is no good answer here. There is no version of this story that does not involve tremendous suffering. Boys who were exposed were sometimes picked up and raised as soldiers. This was particularly common in Sparta, where the state had a vested interest in maintaining a large military force. Exposed male infants, if they were healthy and strong, might be collected and raised in the agoge, the brutal Spartan education system that turned boys into warriors. They would not be citizens. They would not have the full rights and privileges of legitimate Spartan sons. but they would be alive, and they would have a role. Again, is this better or worse than death?
I honestly cannot say.
The agoge was horrifically harsh, but it was also a path to survival and even a certain kind of honor. For mothers who exposed male babies, maybe knowing this possibility existed made it slightly easier to bear. Or maybe it did not. Maybe nothing made it easier. Maybe you just had to shut down that part of your heart and never think about it again in order to survive. There is one more aspect of the amphidromia I want to talk about, and it is the symbolism of the ceremony itself. The father carrying the baby around the hearth, introducing it to the household gods. Think about what that ritual is really doing. It is transforming the baby from a biological entity into a social person. Before the amphidromia, the baby is just a thing that was born. It has no name, no identity, no place in the human community. After the amphidromia, it is somebody. It is a member of this family with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Modern ethicists and philosophers talk a lot about the concept of personhood. When does a human organism become a person with moral status? Is it at conception? At birth? At some point of neural development? Ancient Greeks had their own answer, which was basically, personhood begins when the father says it does. Not at any biological milestone, not at any divine moment of ensoulment, but at the point where the father performs the ritual and declares this baby to be part of the family. It is a profoundly social and political definition of personhood, and it gave fathers enormous power, the power to decide who gets to exist. Not in the biological sense, obviously, but in every sense that mattered in ancient Greek society. And the mothers, they had just provided the raw material. Their role was over. Now it was up to the men to decide what happened next. I wonder if any mothers refused to attend the amphidromia ceremony. If they said, I cannot watch this, I cannot sit there and pretend to celebrate while you decide if my baby gets to live. Were they allowed to refuse, or was that another thing they had no choice about? We do not have answers to these questions. The ancient sources do not tell us, because they were written by men, and men apparently did not think the mother's emotional experience was worth recording. So that is the amphidromia. That is the moment when ancient Greek babies became people, or did not. When fathers exercised their absolute authority over life and death. When mothers had to sit quietly and accept whatever was decided broke their hearts. It is dark, I know it is dark, but I think it is important to understand this aspect of ancient motherhood because it shows us something about how powerless women were. You could risk your life to create a child, and that still did not give you any say in whether that child lived or died. Your body. Your life was gambled, and then the decision-making power was handed to someone else entirely. That is the system. That is what we are trying to understand. Not to excuse it, but to see it clearly. To honor the women who lived through it by acknowledging how hard it really was. In the next part, we're going to turn to something that might seem like a detour, but is actually central to understanding how ancient Greek women survived all of this psychologically and emotionally. Going to talk about the myth of Demeter and Persephone, about the Thesmophoria festival, and about how women created spaces of power and solidarity within a system designed to keep them powerless. We're going to explore how religious ritual became a form of resistance, how mothers found strength in the stories of goddesses who were also mothers, and how a festival that looked like it was just about agricultural fertility was actually about something much deeper and more profound. So stay with me. We're about to discover that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings find ways to create meaning and hope. After everything we have talked about so far, the child marriages, the deadly births, and the fathers who could simply walk away from unwanted babies, you might be wondering how women survived this psychologically. How did they not just break under the weight of it all? How did they find any sense of meaning or power or hope in a world that seemed designed to crush them? Answer, at least part of it, lies in a story. An old story that was already ancient when the classical Greeks told it. A story about a mother and a daughter, about loss and grief and rage, and about what happens when a mother decides she's had enough. Let me tell you about Demeter and Persephone. And let me tell you about the Thesmophoria, a 3-day festival that was unlike anything else in ancient Greek society. Because for 3 days every autumn, the women of Greece took control. Men were not just excluded from this festival, they were forbidden from it, sometimes on pain of death. For 3 days, the normal rules were suspended, and women created their own world. A world where they could speak freely, where they could express their grief and their anger, where they could remember that they were more than just vessels for producing children. And it all revolved around a myth that every woman in ancient Greece knew by heart, a myth that spoke directly to their experience in ways that might not be obvious at first glance. Here is the story, or at least the version that was most commonly told.
Persephone was a young girl, probably around 13 or 14 in most tellings. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest and agriculture. One day Persephone was out in a meadow picking flowers, just being young, being carefree, doing what girls do. And then Hades, god of the underworld, saw her. He wanted her, so he split open the earth, rode up in his chariot, grabbed her, and dragged her down into the realm of the dead. Just like that. No warning, no consent. One moment she was picking flowers, and the next moment she was gone. Demeter, her mother, had no idea what happened. She just knew her daughter was missing. So she wandered the earth, searching, frantic with grief. She disguised herself as an old woman. She asked everyone she met if they had seen her daughter. She neglected all her divine duties because how could she care about harvests and growing things when her child was lost? Eventually she found out the truth. Hades had taken Persephone, and Zeus, the king of the gods, who also happened to be Persephone's father, had given his permission for the abduction. This was all arranged, a deal between men, with Persephone and Demeter having no say in it whatsoever. When Demeter learned this, she did not cry, she did not beg, she got angry. Furiously, destructively angry, she said essentially, if you are going to take my daughter from me, then I am going to make sure the whole world suffers. And she stopped the seasons. She made the earth barren. Nothing would grow, nothing would bloom. Humanity started to starve. Zeus realized he had a problem, so he negotiated a compromise. Persephone would spend part of the year with Hades in the underworld and part of the year with her mother on earth. And this is why the myth explains we have seasons. When Persephone is in the underworld, Demeter grieves and the earth. That is autumn and winter. When Persephone returns, Demeter rejoices and the earth blooms again. That is spring and summer. Now, on the surface, this is an agricultural myth, an explanation for why crops grow in certain seasons and not in others. But if you were a woman in ancient Greece, you heard something else entirely in this story. Think about the parallels. Persephone is a girl of marrying age who gets abducted by an older man and forced into a union she did not choose. Does that sound familiar? That was the lived experience of almost every woman in ancient Greece. The marriage arranged by fathers, the girl who had no say, the sudden rupture from her mother and her childhood home. In fact, the Greek word for marriage, gamos, could also mean abduction. The wedding ceremony itself was called ekdosis, which literally means giving away. The bride was given from her father's house to her husband's house. She was transferred like property. And the parallels to Persephone's abduction were obvious to everyone. There is even a detail in some versions of the myth that makes this connection explicit. After Hades takes Persephone to the underworld, he convinces her to eat pomegranate seeds. And once she's eaten food in the realm of the dead, she is bound there. She cannot leave completely. Now, the pomegranate was a traditional Greek symbol for marriage. It appeared in wedding ceremonies. It was associated with fertility. So when Persephone eats the pomegranate seeds, she is essentially consenting to the marriage, sealing the deal, even though it began with abduction and force. But here is where it gets interesting. The pomegranate was also believed to have contraceptive properties. The ancient Greeks used pomegranate extracts to prevent pregnancy. So there is this subversive reading of the myth where Persephone eats the pomegranate seeds knowing what they do, essentially taking control of her own fertility, saying, "You may have forced me into this marriage, but I am not going to give you children. I am not going to make this easy for you." That reading is contested by scholars. Maybe it is reading too much into the myth, but the fact that it is even possible, the fact that the symbolism is there, suggests that women in ancient Greece were looking for ways to assert agency within the story. Ways to see Persephone not just as a victim, but as someone who found subtle forms of resistance. And then there is Demeter, the mother who refuses to accept what has happened, who does not just grieve quietly and move on, who uses the only power she has, her divine control over agriculture, to force the male gods to negotiate, to give her daughter back, at least partially. Can you imagine how that story must have resonated with mothers who had watched their 13-year-old daughters married off to strange men? Mothers who had no power to stop it, no say in the decision. The myth told them that their grief was valid, that their rage was justified, that a mother's love was a force powerful enough to change the world. The Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is the oldest complete version of this myth that survives, was probably written in the 7th century before the Common Era. But scholars think the myth itself is much, much older. It might go back to the Bronze Age or even earlier, which means generations of Greek mothers told this story to their daughters, who told it to their daughters, who told it to theirs. For centuries, possibly millennia, this myth was passed down as a way of making sense of the pain of separation, the loss of daughters to marriage, the powerlessness of mothers in a patriarchal system. And every autumn, the women gathered to celebrate the Thesmophoria, to ritually enact this myth.
to create a space where they could express what they normally had to keep silent. The Thesmophoria lasted 3 days and took place in late October, around the time when seeds were being sown for the next year's crops. Only married women could participate. Girls who were not yet married and unmarried women were excluded. This was specifically a festival for wives, for women who had gone through the transformation that Persephone went through. Women who understood what it meant to be taken from your mother's house and thrust into a new life with a stranger. Men were absolutely forbidden, not just discouraged, forbidden. There are stories of men who tried to spy on the Thesmophoria and were caught and killed for it. Whether these stories are true or exaggerated warnings, we do not know. But the point was clear. This was women's space. Men were not welcome. And what did the women do during these 3 days? We know some of it, though the rites were supposedly secret, and a lot of the details have been lost. But here is what we can piece together from various ancient sources. On the first day, called Anodos, or the Ascent, women would sacrifice. Yes, pigs. There is a mythological reason for this. According to one version of the story, when Hades opened the earth to abduct Persephone, a swineherd named Eubuleus was nearby with his pigs. And when the earth opened, his pigs fell into the chasm along with Persephone. So sacrificing pigs was a way of commemorating that moment, that rupture. The women would throw the pig carcasses into underground pits called megara, and then, and this is the fascinating part, they would retrieve the remains of pigs that had been thrown into the pits during the previous year's festival. These remains, which had been decomposing underground for a whole year, were brought up and placed on altars. Think about the symbolism there. Things that were buried in darkness and death, brought back up into the light, just like Persephone returning from the underworld. It is a ritual of death and resurrection, of loss and recovery. The decomposed pig remains were then mixed with seeds and scattered on. This was believed to ensure a good harvest. Practical agriculture meets religious ritual. But it was also, I think, about transformation. About how death and decay become the source of new life, about how grief and loss can somehow, eventually, become growth. The second day was called Nestaya, which means the fasting. The women would sit on the ground, not on chairs or cushions, but directly on the earth. They would sit on plants that were believed to have aphrodisiac properties, which is a bit ironic given that they were fasting and abstaining from pleasure. But the point was to commune with the earth, with Demeter in her grief, with the barrenness that comes when the goddess withdraws her blessing. And they would fast. No food, no wine. They would reenact Demeter's mourning, her refusal to eat or drink while her daughter was missing. They would sit there hungry and uncomfortable, and they would talk about their lives, about their sorrows, about the things they could not say in front of their husbands or fathers or sons. There was also something called ritual obscenity that happened during the Thesmophoria, though scholars argue about which day it took place. The women would tell dirty jokes, make crude sexual references, mock men and male authority. This was based on another part of the Demeter myth. When Demeter was wandering the earth in grief, she came to a house where a woman named Iambe made vulgar jokes that finally got Demeter to smile and eat. So, ritual obscenity became part of the festival, a sanctioned time for women to say things that would normally be completely unacceptable. To laugh about sex, to make fun of their husbands, to express frustration and anger through humor. It was a release valve, a way of safely channeling emotions that had no other outlet. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To be a woman in ancient Greece, where you were expected to be modest and silent and obedient all the time, and to suddenly have a day where you could say whatever you wanted, where crudeness and blasphemy and mockery were not just allowed but encouraged. It must have been incredibly liberating. The third day was called Kalligeneia, which means beautiful birth or fair offspring. This was a day of celebration and hope. The women would pray for fertility, both for the fields and for themselves. They would ask Demeter and Persephone to bless them with healthy pregnancies and healthy babies. There is something poignant about that, given everything we know about maternal mortality and infant mortality in ancient Greece. These women were praying for something that was far from guaranteed. They were praying for themselves and their daughters and their friends to survive the reproductive roulette that claimed so many lives. And they were doing it together in a communal act of hope. The festival would end, and the women would return to their homes, to their normal lives. The men would resume control. Patriarchal order would reassert itself, but for 3 days the women had their own world, a world where their grief was acknowledged,
Their anger was valid, and their solidarity with each other was the most important thing. Now, here is what I find most remarkable about the Thesmophoria. It was not some fringe cult practiced by a few women in secret. It was one of the most widespread and respected festivals in all of ancient Greece. It was celebrated in Athens, in Sparta, in cities across the Mediterranean. It was so old that the Greeks themselves did not know when it started. Some scholars think it might date back to the Neolithic period, before the Greeks even arrived in Greece, before patriarchal marriage even existed as an institution, and the men supported it. Financially, I mean. Husbands would pay for their wives to participate. The city-state would provide funding. Public events would be cancelled on the second day of the festival so that women could focus on their rituals. Without distraction. Men did not like being excluded, obviously. There are comedies that make fun of the secrecy and speculate about what women were doing. But they respected the festival enough to stay away. Why? Why would a deeply patriarchal society allow and even encourage a festival that gave women this kind of autonomy, even if only for 3 days? I think it is because at some level the men understood that women needed this, that you cannot keep people powerless and oppressed all the time without giving them some outlet, some release. The Thesmophoria was a pressure valve. It let women express their grief and anger in a controlled, ritualized way. And then they went back to their normal lives, maybe a little less likely to actually rebel because they had been given this small taste of freedom. That is the cynical reading, anyway. The idea that the festival was a tool of control, a way of preventing real resistance by allowing symbolic resistance. But I do not think that is. I think the Thesmophoria was genuinely important to women. I think it gave them something real and valuable, a sense of community, a reminder that they were not alone in their suffering, a space where the bonds between women, particularly between mothers and daughters, between women of different generations, could be honored and strengthened. There is a concept in anthropology called communetas. It refers to the intense feeling of togetherness and equality that can emerge. During rituals, especially rituals that separate participants from their normal social structures, during the Thesmophoria, the usual hierarchies did not matter as much. Rich women and poor women sat on the ground together. They fasted together. They told dirty jokes together. They mourned together. And for those 3 days, the thing that united them, their shared experience as women in a patriarchal society, was more important than the things that divided them. That sense of community, that feeling of solidarity and shared purpose, probably sustained women for the rest of the year. When you were alone in your house, confined to your quarters, enduring pregnancy or childbirth, or recovering from loss, you could remember that there were other women out there who understood, who had been through the same things, who would be there again at the next Thesmophoria to laugh and cry and rage with you. It was not revolution. It was not going to overthrow the system, but it was survival. It was a way of maintaining your humanity and your connections in a world that tried to reduce you to a function. And at the center of it all was the myth, the story of Demeter and Persephone, the story that said, your daughter being taken from you is a tragedy. Your grief over that loss is legitimate. A mother's love is powerful enough to change the course of the seasons, to force even the gods to negotiate. But also, your daughter will survive. She will adapt. She will find a way to live in underworld, and she will come back to you at least part of the time. The separation is not permanent. The bond between mother and daughter endures. What a gift that story must have been to the mothers of ancient Greece. To know that their feelings, their specific female experiences, were important enough to be the subject of one of the most central myths in their culture. To know that the goddess who controlled where the crops grew or failed understood what it felt like to lose a daughter too. Marriage. The men had their myths too, of course, stories about heroes and warriors and conquest. But the women had Demeter, and that mattered. In our next part, we're going to get much more practical and intimate. We're going to step into the birthing room and talk about what actually happened when a woman went into labor in ancient Greece. Who was there to help her? What techniques did they use to ease the pain? What did midwives know, and what did they get wrong? We're going to talk about the smells and the sweat and the fear, about the herbs and the prayers and the controlled breathing. We're going to understand what it really meant to give birth in a world without modern medicine, but also without the isolation that many women experience in modern hospital births. So stay close. We are about to witness something that is both terrifying and strangely intimate, both ancient and somehow timeless. So we have spent time in the realm of myth and ritual, in the secret spaces where women gathered to grieve and laugh and find solidarity in a world that refused to give them power. Now we're going somewhere much more intimate, much more physical, and honestly much more intense. We're going into the birthing room. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine it. A small room in an ancient Athenian house, lamplight flickering against plastered walls. the smell of burning herbs mingling with the close, warm air. A young woman, perhaps 18, perhaps 20, lying on a simple wooden bed or crouching on a birthing stool with a carved-out seat. Around her, a circle of women, her mother, her sisters, her neighbors, who have all been through this themselves. And in the middle of them all, a woman with steady hands and deep, calm eyes, who has done this perhaps 100 times before. The midwife, the Maya in ancient Greek. She is not a doctor. She has no degree, no official certification. What she has is knowledge. Knowledge built from years of attending, from watching and learning and making mistakes and recovering from them. Knowledge that lives in her hands and her instincts and her memory of every birth she has ever attended. And right now, that knowledge is all that stands between the young woman on the bed and disaster. Let us start with who these women actually were, because the midwives of ancient Greece are often misunderstood. They were not outsiders or social outcasts. They were respected, skilled professionals who occupied a vital role in every community. The philosopher Plato had a famous theory about knowledge which he called maueutics, meaning the art of the midwife. His idea was that philosophical inquiry was like midwifery. A teacher helps a student bring forth knowledge that was already inside them, just as a midwife helps a mother bring forth the child that was already inside her. Plato's own mother, interestingly enough, was traditionally said to have been a midwife named Phanerate. Whether or not that is historically accurate, the detail tells us something about how midwives were perceived. Not as servants or social inferiors, but as skilled women doing essential work. We know from ancient sources that midwives in Athens had to meet certain qualifications. According to a text attributed to Cyrenus of Ephesus, who wrote a gynecological handbook in the 2nd century of the Common Era but drew on earlier Greek traditions, an ideal midwife should be literate, have good memory, love hard work, be respectable in conduct and not be too young or too old. She should have delicate hands with short, clipped nails. She should be free from superstition. She shall have a thorough knowledge of the foods, drinks, and herbs that might help or harm during labor. That last qualification is interesting. Free from superstition means superstition was apparently common enough among midwives that it was worth warning against. The ideal and the reality were probably somewhat different. In practice, midwives were women who had given birth themselves and then apprenticed with more experienced practitioners. They learned through observation, through assisting, through gradually being given more responsibility as their skills developed. It was the same pattern we see in traditional craft apprenticeships, because that is essentially what it was. A craft, a skill, a body of knowledge passed from woman to woman across generations. Now, what actually happened when labor started? The moment a woman began her contractions in earnest, a flurry of activity began. The midwife was summoned immediately, because in ancient Greece, birth was always considered a potential emergency. You did not wait to see how things progressed. You called the midwife at the first sign of labor because you wanted her there before things got complicated. The midwife would arrive and make her assessment. She would examine the mother, checking the position of the baby, assessing how far along labor had progressed. The birthing room itself would be arranged with care. Heavy fabric would be hung over the windows and doors. This served multiple purposes: privacy, obviously, but also temperature regulation and a dimming of the light, which was believed to make labor easier. The darkness, the warm, enclosed space, the presence of trusted women. There is something instinctively right about that environment that even modern research on birth has begun to rediscover. Women often labor better in warm, quiet, private spaces rather than bright clinical environments. The birthing stool would be prepared. This was a standard piece of equipment, a chair with a curved opening in the seat, low enough that the mother could plant her feet firmly on the floor. It allowed gravity to assist the baby's descent and gave the mother a stable position to push from. It also positioned the midwife perfectly, sitting on a lower stool directly in front, hands ready to guide and catch. Here is something that genuinely surprised me when I first learned it. The ancient Greek midwives used controlled breathing techniques during labor. This should sound familiar because controlled breathing, patterned breathing, is the foundation of the Lamaze method that's been taught to pregnant women in the 20th and 21st centuries as a way to manage pain during childbirth. Most people think of Lamaze as a modern innovation. It was developed formally by a French obstetrician in the 1950s, but the principle behind it, the idea that conscious, controlled breathing helps manage labor pain and keeps the mother calm and focused, that principle was understood in ancient Greece. Midwives would coach laboring women to breathe in specific patterns, to exhale during contractions rather than holding their breath and tensing up. They understood, through practical observation rather than physiological theory, that breath control helped, that it gave the mother something to focus on.
something she could actively do in a situation that often felt completely out of her control. Alongside the breathing techniques, the midwives would apply warm cloths to the mother's abdomen. The heat helped relax the muscles, provided comfort, and seemed to ease the intensity of contractions. They would also perform massage, firm rhythmic pressure on the lower back and abdomen that we now know activates the body's own pain relief systems. Strong-smelling substances were sometimes held under. The mother's nose, myrrh, which was also one of the most important ritual substances in ancient religion, was commonly used. The strong scent was believed to draw the womb downward, to encourage the baby to descend. The physiological reasoning was wrong. But the practice of using strong scents during labor to maintain consciousness and stimulate the senses was not without some practical effect. The herbs were a critical part of the midwife's toolkit, and this is where things get both fascinating and concerning by modern standards. Artemisia, named for the goddess Artemis, who was also a protector of women in childbirth, was used to stimulate contractions that were not progressing well. We know today that plants in the Artemisia family contain compounds that can affect uterine contractions. So this was not just superstition. There was real pharmacological effect. Squirting cucumber, which sounds like something out of a comedy sketch, was also used to stimulate labor. It is a powerful plant, actually dangerously powerful, that contains compounds which cause strong contractions of smooth muscle tissue. In the wrong dose, it could cause violent, uncontrollable contractions that would harm both mother and baby. In the right dose, it might help move a stalled labor forward. This is the fundamental tension of herbal medicine in any era. The difference between medicine and poison is often just a question of quantity, and without standardized dosing, without a way to measure concentrations precisely, using these powerful herbs was genuinely risky. An experienced midwife with years of practice probably had a good intuitive sense of how much to use and when. A less experienced one could easily give too much. After the birth, the midwife's work was not finished. The placenta needed to be delivered, and this was considered just as dangerous a moment as the birth itself. If the placenta was retained, if any portion of it remained inside the uterus, severe infection would follow. Myrrh and other herbs were used to encourage the uterus to expel the placenta completely. The midwife would examine it carefully afterward, checking that it appeared whole and intact. And then came the assessment of the newborn. The midwife would signal to the room whether the baby was male or female. This information had enormous practical consequences, as we've talked about, in relation to the amphidromia and the symbols on the door. But the midwife also performed her own assessment of the baby's health and viability. She would examine the infant carefully, looking for obvious physical problems, checking that the baby was breathing, that its color was strong. This assessment was honest and practical. If the baby had severe physical problems that seemed incompatible with survival, the midwife would note this, and this information would factor into the father's decision about whether to accept or expose the infant. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this aspect of the midwife's role. She was not just a healer, she was also in a sense an assessor. Her evaluation of the newborn's viability carried real weight in determining whether that child would live or die. That is an extraordinary amount of power and responsibility for one woman to hold in her hands. What I find most remarkable about the Greek midwives is not any individual technique or practice. It is the totality of what they managed to accomplish with the resources they had. Working without anesthesia, without surgical tools, without antibiotics, without any of the infrastructure of modern obstetrics, they supported millions of women through one of the most dangerous experiences in human life. Were they always successful? Absolutely not. We have seen the statistics. We have read the tombstones. Many women died despite the midwife's best efforts. Some died because of mistakes. The knowledge was real but imperfect. The herbs were effective but dangerous. Techniques were sound but limited. But within those constraints, these women showed up. Every single time they were called, in the middle of the night, in the depths of winter, in situations that must have seemed hopeless. They showed up with their worn leather bags and their steady hands and their deep reservoirs of knowledge, and they did what they could. And sometimes, more often than you might expect given the circumstances, it was enough. In our next part, we're going to explore the spiritual dimension of childbirth in ancient Greece. The goddesses women prayed to when medicine reached its limits, the offerings they made, the amulets they wore, the rituals that surrounded every stage of pregnancy and labor. Because understanding ancient Greek motherhood means understanding that for these women, the line between medicine and religion was essentially non-existent. Prayer was not a supplement to treatment. It was part of the treatment. So stay with me as we enter the sacred world of Artemis, Hera, and Eileithyia, the goddesses who held laboring women in their divine hands. Every woman who has ever waited for news from a hospital room knows something about prayer. That instinct to reach beyond what we can control, to appeal to something greater than ourselves when the stakes are too high for any human effort to feel adequate. It is one of the oldest human responses to uncertainty. And in ancient Greece, where uncertainty was woven into every birth, every pregnancy, every sleepless night spent wondering if your child would survive, prayer was not just comfort.
It was strategy. Let me take you into this world, into the sacred spaces where Greek mothers left their most precious offerings, into the rituals that accompanied every stage of pregnancy and birth, and into the complicated, deeply human relationship between these women and their goddesses. Because here is what you need to understand. For a woman in ancient Greece, the gods were not abstract
theological concepts to be debated by philosophers. They were real, they were present, they intervened in daily life. And the goddesses of childbirth were among the most actively worshipped deities in the entire Greek pantheon because women needed them desperately, and they knew it. At the center of it all was Eileithyia. If you have never heard that name before, you are forgiven. She tends to get overshadowed by the more famous Olympians in popular retellings of Greek mythology. But in the daily, religious lives of ordinary Greek women, Eileithyia was arguably the most important goddess of all. She was specifically the goddess of childbirth, just that, nothing else. No side portfolio of agriculture or wisdom or warfare. Her entire divine purpose was to attend women in labor. The name Eileithyia comes from a Greek verb that means to come or to arrive. She was the goddess who came when she was needed, the divine midwife. Ancient sources describe Eileithyia in two contradictory aspects. Sometimes she was the goddess who helped birth proceed smoothly, who guided the baby into the world gently and safely. But sometimes she was depicted with her arms crossed over her chest, her hands gripping her own garments, a posture that was believed to slow or stop labor entirely. Because in ancient Greek theology, the gods were not simply good. They could withhold their gifts as easily as they gave them. This duality is deeply revealing. It shows us how unpredictably terrifying childbirth. Some labors went smoothly, some did not. Some babies came quickly and safely. Some stuck and killed their mothers in the process. And since the Greeks could not explain the medical reasons for this variability, they attributed it to divine will. Eileithyia was present at every birth. Sometimes she helped, sometimes she withheld her help, and women could only hope that their prayers and offerings would convince her to be generous. Then there was Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, of the moon, of wilderness and wild things. She might seem like an odd choice for a goddess of women's health, given that she was also the goddess of virginity and famously chose to remain unmarried and childless herself. But Artemis had a long association with transitions in women's lives, particularly with the passage from girlhood to womanhood. She was worshipped at the sanctuary of Brauron on the eastern coast of Attica, where young girls called arktoi, meaning she bears, would spend time in service to the goddess before their marriage. This was a coming-of-age ritual, a way of marking the transition from childhood to adulthood, from the freedom of girlhood to the constraints of married life. And this transition was precisely why Artemis was also invoked during childbirth. Not because she understood motherhood from personal experience, but because she presided over thresholds, over the dangerous in-between places, the moments of passage when a person moves from one state of being to another. And what is childbirth if not the most dramatic threshold of all? The moment when a woman becomes a mother, the moment when a fetus becomes a child, the crossing from one world into another. There is also a darker connection. Artemis, in some traditions, was a goddess who could send sudden death to women, a quick, clean death. And women who died in childbirth were sometimes described as having been struck by Artemis arrows. It sounds harsh to modern ears, but in a way it was a form of honoring them. Dying with a huntress's arrow was a warrior's death. It was swift and decisive. It was the opposite of suffering slowly from disease. So women prayed to Artemis before labor, asking her to stand on the side of life rather than death, asking her to let this birth be one of the smooth ones, not one of the arrows. Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, was the third member of this divine trinity of childbirth protectors. Her role was perhaps the most politically charged. Hera was the patron of legal, recognized marriage. She represented the institution that gave women their social identity and their right to bear legitimate children. Praying to Hera during childbirth was therefore not just about the physical process. It was about legitimacy, about the child being born into a proper family structure recognized by the gods as well as by society. It was about the mother being protected in her role as a legitimate wife rather than a concubine or a slave. There is something almost political about invoking Hera during labor. It was a claim, a statement of status. This birth is happening within the bounds of legitimate marriage. This child has the right to exist, to be named, to be accepted. This mother deserves protection. The offerings these women made to their goddesses were not casual gestures. They were carefully chosen, often expensive and deeply meaningful. Clothing was among the most common offerings. Women would dedicate pieces of their clothing, particularly garments worn during labor or pregnancy, to female deities as expressions of thanks. The cloth itself has almost entirely disintegrated over the millennia, which is why archaeologists mostly find the metal fastenings, the belt clasps, the pins, the brooches that once held those garments together. And here is that number again because it bears repeating. Among all the belt clasps found at ancient Greek religious sites, 84% were dedicated to female. 8 out of 10. That is an overwhelming statistic. It tells us that the practice of dedicating clothing accessories to goddesses as part of reproductive rituals was not a minority practice. It was ubiquitous. Almost every woman who survived a successful birth was doing it. The belt or girdle was particularly significant because of the ritual of loosening it during labor. When contractions began, a woman would loosen her belt as a symbolic and possibly practical gesture. Symbolically, it was an opening, a welcoming, an invitation to the baby to come out. Practically, the loosening of tight fabric around the abdomen may have genuinely helped with breathing and comfort during contractions. After the birth, the belt would be dedicated to the goddess. It was a way of saying, "This belt witnessed my survival. I am returning it to you in gratitude." The opening it represented was answered. The prayer was heard. There were also votive offerings made of terracotta, small clay, figurines and model objects left at temples and shrines. Some were in the shape of body parts. Uterus-shaped votives were left by women seeking fertility or protection during pregnancy. Breast-shaped votives were left in relation to nursing. Male votives, including phallic shapes, might be left by husbands hoping for children. These offerings were found at the shrines of all three of the major childbirth goddesses, but particularly at the sanctuary of Eileithyia. At her shrine in Amnisos on the island of Crete, archaeologists found votives that date back thousands of years, suggesting this was one of the oldest continuously worshipped sacred sites associated with childbirth in the entire Greek world. When a woman was struggling to conceive, she might make a pilgrimage to one of these sanctuaries. She would present her offering, say her prayers, sometimes sleep in the sacred precinct, hoping for a divine dream that would offer guidance or reassurance. The combination of prayer and ritual and community, the sense of being connected to thousands of other women who had stood in this same place and asked for the same help, must have been profoundly powerful. Amulets were another layer of protection. Pregnant women in ancient Greece commonly wore amulets made of hematite, a dark reddish-brown stone that was associated with blood and therefore with reproductive processes. Hematite amulets were often carved into the shape of a uterus. Wearing one was believed to keep the real uterus in its proper place, stable and healthy, not wandering. There is something almost poignant about that image. A woman already facing the real physical dangers of pregnancy, without any of the medical resources we take for granted, pressing a small stone against her belly and hoping it would keep her safe. Not because she was foolish, but because she was doing everything available to her. She was taking action in a situation where action was desperately needed and options were desperately limited. Herbs also had a dual role, practical and magical. Certain plants were believed to have protective properties beyond their pharmacological effects. Artemisia, that herb of Artemis, was burned in the birthing room partly for its medicinal effects on the uterus, but also as a form of invocation. The name itself was an appeal to the goddess. Burning her plant in your house during labor was a way of saying, "Artemis, I am calling on you. Be here, be with us." What I find most moving about all of this is the sheer comprehensiveness of it. These women left nothing to chance that could be addressed. Medical interventions from the midwife, physical preparations of the birthing room, breathing techniques and herbal remedies, prayer to multiple goddesses simultaneously, amulets against misfortune, ritual loosening of clothing, offerings promised in advance and delivered in gratitude after. If you were a pregnant woman in ancient Greece and you believed in the system, and most women genuinely did, then you were surrounded by layers of protection, medicine and magic, human skill and divine attention, community support and individual devotion. All of it working together. All of it aimed at the same goal, surviving this birth and bringing a healthy baby into the world. Did it work sometimes? Not because the gods intervened, though the women believed they did, but because the combination of real medical knowledge in the midwife's hands, emotional support from the community of women present, and the psychological benefit of religious ritual genuinely helped. A calmer, laboring mother often has an easier birth. A woman who believes she's protected is less likely to panic. Belief is not nothing. Ritual is not nothing. Community is not nothing. The goddesses of ancient Greece did not save those mothers. The women saved each other. But the goddesses gave them a framework for understanding and coping with the experience, a way of making meaning in the face of mortal fear.
Honestly, I think we underestimate how much that mattered. In our next part, we're going to leave the sacred and step into the very personal. We're going to talk about what happened in those 40 days after birth, the strange period of isolation and recovery that the Greeks called necessary because of ritual pollution, but which functioned as something far more complex and human than that. We're going to explore the postpartum world of ancient Greek mothers and discover that it holds surprising lessons for our own time, so stay close. The story is getting quieter now, more intimate, more tender. The baby has been born. The umbilical cord has been cut. The midwife has cleaned the infant and wrapped it in soft cloth. The amphidromia has happened, and by some miracle or mercy, the father has accepted the child. It has a name now. It is officially part of the family. The mother survived the birth, which means she beat the odds one more time. But the story does not end there. Because in ancient Greece, what happened after birth was almost as important as the birth itself. There was a period of isolation that every new mother had to go through. 40 days. 40 days where she and the baby were essentially quarantined from the rest of the world, hidden away, kept separate, not because of any medical understanding of infection or recovery, although those were real concerns, but because of something deeper and more mysterious, something the ancient Greeks called miasma. Pollution, ritual impurity, the belief that childbirth, for all its necessity and naturalness, was also somehow contaminating, and that contamination had to be carefully managed before the mother could rejoin normal society. Let me take you inside those 40 days and show you what life was like for a woman who had just become a mother, or who had just become a mother again for the 6th or 7th time. Because the isolation happened after every birth, not just the first one. 40 days in the shadows. First, we need to understand what miasma actually meant to the ancient Greeks. It is a concept that does not translate cleanly into modern terms because we do not really think this way anymore. But miasma was essentially a kind of spiritual pollution that could come from contact with certain powerful life events. Birth, death, violence, sex in some contexts. These were all things that were simultaneously natural and necessary, but also dangerous in a metaphysical sense. Miasma was not about hygiene in the way we understand it. It was not about germs or bacteria, which the Greeks knew nothing about. It was about maintaining the proper boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between the pure and the impure. And childbirth, being such an intense and primal event involving so much blood and bodily fluids and the literal creation of new life, was absolutely drenched in miasma. A woman who had just given birth was considered ritually impure. She could not participate in religious ceremonies. She could not enter temples. She could not prepare food for others or touch sacred objects. In some interpretations, she could not even be looked at by people outside her immediate household. She was, in a sense, temporarily outside the normal social order. And so she was isolated, kept in a special part of the house called the gynekar, the women's quarters. Only other women, particularly close female relatives, could attend. To her, during this time, the baby too was kept separate. For the first 10 days it had no name, no social identity. And for the full 40 days it was not formally presented to the outside world. Why 40 days? We do not know for certain. 40 is a number that shows up a lot in ancient ritual contexts. 40 days and 40 nights in various purification rituals. Maybe it was based on the lunar cycle. Maybe it was based on observation of how long postpartum bleeding typically lasted. Maybe it was just tradition handed down for so long that nobody remembered the original reason. But the result was the same. 40 days in isolation, 40 days of healing and bonding and learning how to be a mother, or learning how to be a mother again with one more child added to the mix. Now, isolation might sound terrible to you, and in some ways I am sure it was. Imagine being confined to one part of the house for over a month, not allowed to go outside, not allowed to see most of your friends. Extended family. If you ask someone who gets claustrophobic or who needs social interaction to feel human, that would be its own kind of torture. But I also think there was something protective about it. Something that, intentionally or not, gave new mothers what they desperately needed, time to recover. Think about what a woman's body had just been through. 9 months of pregnancy putting enormous strain on every system. Then labor, which might have lasted hours or even days.
Bleeding, exhaustion beyond anything you can imagine if you've never experienced it. And now, almost immediately, she was expected to nurse the baby, which is its own physically demanding process. Her body needed to heal. She needed rest. The 40-day isolation period forced that rest. Yes, she was still responsible for the baby. Yes, she still had to nurse and change and soothe, but she was not expected to do anything else. The household work was taken over by other women, by female slaves if the family had them, by her mother or sisters or mother-in-law if they were available. For 40 days, her only job was to recover and care for the newborn. In many modern cultures, we have completely lost this. New mothers are expected to bounce back almost immediately, to get back to work, back to their normal responsibilities. We have this cultural narrative of the supermom who gives birth and then is up and running a marathon 2 weeks later, or something equally absurd. And we wonder why. Postpartum depression is so common, why so many women struggle. The ancient Greeks, for all their many faults, at least understood that birth was traumatic and that recovery took time. The 40-day isolation was not framed as a gift or a break. It was framed as pollution and danger. But the practical effect was that it gave women space to heal. Sometimes the right thing happens for the wrong reasons. During those 40 days, the new mother was not completely alone. She had other women with her.
And this is where we see something really beautiful about female kinship networks in ancient Greece.
Your mother would come to stay with you if she was still alive. Your sisters, your aunts, female friends who had been through childbirth themselves and knew what you were going through. They would take turns caring for you, bringing you food, helping you with the baby, giving you advice. This was knowledge passed down from woman to woman, mother to daughter, for generations. How to position thee, how to deal with sore breasts, how to soothe a crying infant, how to recognize the signs that something was wrong, that the baby was sick or that you were developing an infection. The midwife who attended the birth might also check in periodically during those 40 days, making sure both mother and baby were thriving. There is something about this that feels almost radical compared to the male-dominated world outside. Out there in the public sphere, women had no power. They could not vote, could not own property, could not represent themselves legally. But in the Gynekon, during those 40 days after birth, women were in charge. They were the experts. They were the ones with the knowledge and the authority. This was their domain, and men were explicitly excluded from it. I imagine there was a kind of camaraderie in that space, a feeling of solidarity. You're recovering from something terrifying, something that almost killed you, and surrounding you are women who have been through the same thing, who survived, who can reassure you that what you are feeling is normal, that the pain will fade, that you will figure out how to be a mother even if it feels impossible right now. That support network was crucial because without it, without those other women, a new mother in ancient Greece would have been completely overwhelmed and alone. The husbands were not involved. That was considered women's business, beneath the attention of men. So if you did not have female relatives or friends to help you, your chances of surviving those first 40 days, both physically and mentally, were much lower. The 40-day period also served another important function. It was a buffer, a grace period, time to see if the baby was going to survive. Remember, infant mortality in the first few weeks of life was staggeringly high. Some babies were born with problems that were not immediately obvious. Some developed infections. Some just failed to thrive for reasons nobody understood. So the 40-day isolation gave families time to see if this baby was going to make it before fully integrating it into the household and the community. This sounds cold and calculating, and in a way it was. But it was also a form of emotional protection. If you have already announced the birth to everyone, if you have already had the naming ceremony and the celebrations, and then the baby dies a week later, the grief is more public and more complicated. But if the baby dies during the isolation period, before it has been formally presented to the world, the loss can be mourned more privately. I'm not saying this makes the grief any less real. A mother who loses a baby after 1 week of life is just as devastated as a mother who loses a baby after 1 year. But there is something to be said for having time and space to process that loss without the entire community watching and judging. And if the baby survived those crucial first 40 days, that was a good sign. Not a guarantee, obviously. Babies could still die after that from disease or accident or any number of causes, but making it to 40 days meant you'd gotten through the most dangerous period. The odds of survival went up significantly. At the end of the 40 days, there was another ritual, a purification ceremony. The mother would be ritually cleansed, symbolically washing away the miasma of childbirth. The exact details varied depending on the city-state and the family's specific religious practices, but generally it involved bathing, prayers to the appropriate goddesses, offerings at a household altar or at a temple. After this purification, the mother was allowed to rejoin normal society. She could leave the gynecan. She could participate in religious festivals again. She could interact with people outside the household. The period of isolation was over, and the baby too would be formally presented to the extended family and the community for the first time. This was often celebrated with a small gathering, a way of introducing the new life to the social world it would grow up in. There must have been such relief in that moment. Making it through the birth, making it through the 40 days, both mother and baby alive and relatively healthy. It was worth celebrating because it was genuinely an achievement, a victory against odds that claimed so many lives. But it was also bittersweet, I think, because the end of isolation meant the end of that protected space. Mother had to go back to her regular duties, back to running the household, back to being under her husband's authority in all things. The brief period where she was cared for, where her needs were prioritized, was over. Now she was expected to be productive again. And if she had other children, she had to balance the needs of the newborn with the needs of the older ones, all while managing a household. And of course, in a few years, she would probably go through the whole thing again. Another pregnancy, another birth, another 40 days of isolation. The cycle continued. I want to talk about something that the ancient sources do not really address, but that I think must have been a huge factor in women's experience of those 40 days. Postpartum mental health. We know now that many women experience postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. These are conditions caused by the massive hormonal shifts that happen after birth, combined with the stress and sleep deprivation of caring. For a newborn, they are real medical conditions, not character flaws or weaknesses, and they are incredibly common. Something like 10 to 20% of new mothers experience significant postpartum depression. The ancient Greeks had no concept of this. They had no understanding of hormones or brain chemistry. They had no treatment for it beyond general rest and the support of other women. But that does not mean women did not experience it. Imagine being a new mother in ancient Greece. Isolated in the gynecan, feeling overwhelmed and hopeless, and unable to bond with your baby the way you thought you would. Feeling like something is wrong with you, like you're failing at the most basic female function, and having no framework to understand that what you are experiencing is a medical condition, not a moral failing. Did women talk about these feelings with the other women who were caring for them? Did mothers recognize the signs in their daughters because they had been through they themselves, or was there shame and silence around it, a pressure to pretend everything was fine even when it was not? We do not have answers to these questions because the sources do not talk about it, but I would bet anything that ancient Greek women experienced postpartum depression at rates similar to modern women, and I hope that at least some of them had supportive female relatives who could say, "I felt this way too. It gets better. You are not broken." There is one more aspect of 40-day isolation that I want to touch on, and it is the most speculative but also maybe the most important. I think those 40 days were when women taught each other the secrets, the things men were not supposed to know, the herbs that could be used for contraception or to induce miscarriage, the techniques for managing pain or illness without consulting a male physician, the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women, carefully guarded because it represented the little bit of control they had over their own bodies. We know that ancient Greek women used various plants and herbs for reproductive health. Silphium, which may have been a species of giant fennel, was famous as a contraceptive. It was so widely used that it was harvested to extinction. Pennyroyal, artemisia, and other plants were used to bring on delayed menstruation, which could mean ending an early pregnancy. Male physicians wrote about some of these remedies in their medical texts. But the knowledge originally came from women, from midwives and mothers and healers, who learned through experience and observation. And much of that knowledge was never written down because women were not the ones writing the texts. It was oral tradition, shared in private spaces like the gynecan during those 40 days after birth. A new mother, especially a young one giving birth for the first time, would be initiated into this secret knowledge, taught by older women who had survived multiple pregnancies and who knew how to navigate the system. How to space births to give your body time to recover. How to prevent pregnancy when you simply could not face another one. How to end a pregnancy if you had to. This knowledge was power. Limited power, certainly, but it was something. It was a way of asserting agency in a world that tried to deny women any agency at all. And the 40-day isolation period was the perfect time to pass it on because men were excluded. And what happened in the gynecan stayed in the gynecan. I think about those 40 days a lot, about what they must have been like for different women in different circumstances. For a young first-time mother, terrified and in pain, learning everything for the first time. For an older woman giving birth to her 7th child, exhausted but experienced, going through the motions one more time. For a woman whose baby died during those 40 days, grieving in private before having to rejoin the world and pretend she was.
Fine, there is something almost liminal about that period.
Liminal is an anthropology term that means existing on a threshold, in between one state and another. The 40 days after childbirth were a liminal time. The mother was not quite part of normal society yet, but she was no longer pregnant either. The baby was alive, but not yet fully recognized as a person. Everything was in between. Everything was uncertain. And maybe that uncertainty, that liminality, was part of why the isolation was necessary. It gave everyone time to adjust, to transition from who they were before to who they would be after.
The woman was not just the covering from birth. She was becoming a mother, or becoming a mother again with a different identity. That takes time. It takes space.
It takes the support of people who understand what you're going through. The ancient Greeks, with their concept of miasma and ritual pollution, created that time and space. Not for the right reasons, necessarily, not because they understood postpartum recovery or emotional processing, but because their religious and cultural framework demanded it. And sometimes, as I said before, the right thing happens for the wrong reasons. When those 40 days ended and the purification ritual was complete, life went on. The mother returned to her duties. The baby became part of the household routine. The next pregnancy was probably already on the horizon, but those 40 days had happened. That period of isolation and rest and female solidarity had existed, and whatever healing or learning or bonding occurred during that time became part of the woman's story, part of how she survived the impossible demands of motherhood in ancient Greece. In our next part, we're going to talk about something that might seem superficial, but that actually tells us a lot about how ancient Greek society viewed boys versus girls, sons versus daughters. We're going to explore the public announcement of birth, the symbols that families displayed on their doors to announce whether the baby was male or female. An olive wreath for a boy, symbolizing the warrior he would someday become. A tuft of wool for a girl, symbolizing the domestic work that would define her life. And we are going to dig into what those symbols reveal about value and expectation, about celebration and resignation, about how deeply the preference for sons was embedded in every aspect of the culture. So stay with me. We're going to look at how something as simple as a wreath on a door could carry the weight of an entire gender system. Sometimes the most revealing things about a culture are not the grand monuments or the philosophical treatises. Sometimes they are small gestures, symbols so simple that you might walk past them without noticing. A wreath hanging on a door, a bit of wool tied to a doorpost. Tiny announcements that told the whole neighborhood something important had happened inside. A baby had been born, and depending on what was. Hanging on that door, you knew immediately whether to congratulate the family enthusiastically or offer polite acknowledgement before moving on. An olive wreath meant a boy, the future, hope, investment, a child who would grow up to be a citizen, a soldier, maybe even someone important. This was cause for celebration. Neighbors would stop by with gifts and good wishes. The father would walk a little taller. This was what he had been hoping for. A tuft of wool meant a girl, another mouth to feed. Until you could marry her off. Another dowry to save for. Another daughter who would leave your household to join someone else's. Neighbors might nod sympathetically. Which was good, but it was not a boy. For yes, the mother and baby were alive, which was good, but it was not a boy. It was not what anyone really wanted. Two symbols, two completely different receptions, two completely different futures, and the baby only hours or days old, already being judged based on something it had no control over. Let me tell you what these symbols actually meant and what they reveal about how ancient Greek mothers navigated a world that valued their sons and merely tolerated their daughters. The olive wreath was not just any decoration. The olive tree was sacred to Athena, the patron goddess of Athens and the goddess of wisdom and warfare. Olive wreaths were given to victors at athletic competitions. They symbolized achievement, excellence, glory. When a family hung an olive wreath on their door to announce the birth of a son, they were making a statement. This child will bring honor to our family. This child will compete in the agora, fight in battle, participate in the democratic process. This child matters, and the symbolism went even deeper. The olive tree was also an economic powerhouse in ancient Greece. Olive oil was one of the most valuable commodities they produced. It was used for cooking, lighting, religious rituals, athletic training. Olive groves were a source of Wealth, so the olive wreath also carried connotations of prosperity and productivity.
This boy will contribute economically, he will be an asset. The wool, on the other hand, was about domesticity, about the interior life of the household, which was considered women's domain. Wool had to be spun into thread and woven into cloth. This was the primary occupation of women in ancient Greece, hours and hours of sitting at a loom, creating the fabric that would clothe the family. It was necessary.
Work, certainly, but it was also monotonous, repetitive, hidden away. Nobody celebrated the woman who wove the most cloth. There were no competitions or glory for excellent weaving, at least not in the way there were for male athletic or intellectual achievements. So when a family hung a tuft of wool on the door to announce the birth of a daughter, they were saying, "Here is another worker for the household, another pair of hands to help with the domestic tasks, useful but not exceptional. Necessary but not celebrated." Can you imagine being that baby girl's mother? You are lying in the gynecology, exhausted and in pain. You are looking at your daughter, this tiny human you created, and you know that outside, people are walking past your door and seeing that tuft of wool and thinking, another girl. How does that feel? Do you internalize that disappointment? Do you look at your daughter and feel apologetic, like you have somehow failed by not producing a son? Or do you hold her closer and promise yourself that you will love her fiercely, even though the world has already decided she is worth less? The preference for sons was not unique to ancient Greece, of course. It has existed in patriarchal societies throughout history and continues to exist in many places today. But what strikes me about ancient Greece is how open and unapologetic it was. There was no pretense that daughters were equally valuable, no polite fiction. That parents loved all their children the same regardless of gender. The bias was right there on the door for everyone to see, and it was backed up by economic reality. Raising a daughter really was more expensive in concrete financial terms, at least from the father's perspective. You had to provide a dowry when she married. This could be substantial depending on your social class. Land, money, household goods. The dowry was meant to support the daughter in her new household and to compensate the husband's family for taking her on. But from the birth father's point of view, it was a cost with no return. Then paid someone to take her off your hands, and then she became part of another family's household economy. Sons, on the other hand, stayed. They inherited your property. They took care of you in old age. They performed the proper funeral rites when you died, which was considered essential for your peace in the afterlife. They carried on the family name and the family line. From a purely economic standpoint, sons were a net positive and daughters were a net negative. This is why, as we talked about earlier, baby girls were at much higher risk of being exposed. Why families who already had one daughter might reject a second one. Why even families who accepted their daughters did so with resignation rather than celebration. But here is where it gets complicated. Because while the culture as a whole devalued daughters, individual, mothers often love their daughters intensely. Maternal love does not follow the logic of economics or social status. You carry a baby for 9 months. You risk your life giving birth, you nurse and care for that child, and you love them. Whether they have a penis or a vulva becomes almost irrelevant in the face of that bond. So you have this tension, this disconnect between what society tells you your daughter is worth and what you feel in your heart. And mothers had to navigate that tension. Somehow, they had to find ways to protect and nurture their daughters in a world that saw them as disposable. One of the ways they did this, I think, was through the female kinship networks we've talked about. Mothers teaching daughters, aunts and grandmothers passing down knowledge, women creating value systems that existed in parallel to the male-dominated public values. Yes, your daughter would not be a citizen or a soldier or a philosopher, but she would be part of this unbroken chain. Women who knew things, who understood the rhythms of the household and the secrets of healing and the techniques of survival. She would have her own kind of power, even if it was not the kind that got written down in history books. Mothers knew this. They must have. And I imagine they tried to teach their daughters to find pride and meaning in this separate sphere. To understand that just because the men did not value you did not mean you had no value. That there was strength in the work of women, in the bonds between women. That you could survive and even find joy in a system designed to marginalize you. But that is a lot of weight to put on a child. To tell her, the world thinks you're worthless, but we know better. Believe in your own value even though everything around you says otherwise. It is a message of resistance, but it is also a message born of necessity because there is no alternative. And some daughters, I am sure, internalize the cultural message instead, grew up believing that they really were inferior, that their brothers were more important, that their own lives and desires mattered less. How could you not internalize it when it was everywhere, from the wreath on the door on the day you were born to the legal status you had your entire life? The symbolism of the olive wreath versus the wool also set up expectations for what the child's life would be. The boy would be educated. He would learn to read and write, study mathematics and music, train in athletics. He would be prepared for public life, for participation in the civic and military spheres. The world outside the household was his to explore and conquer. The girl would be educated too, but differently. She would learn practical skills, how to run a household, how to weave and spin, how to manage slaves if the family had them. Maybe some reading and writing, but only enough to keep accounts. Her education was preparation for domesticity, not for public engagement. And from the very beginning, from the moment of that symbol on the door, everyone knew which path the child would follow. The boy got the olive wreath, the symbol of potential and achievement. The girl got the wool, the symbol of limitation and confinement. Their fates were decided before they could speak or walk or have any say in the matter. I find myself wondering what the mothers thought as they looked at those symbols. Did they ever question it? Did they ever think, why should my daughter's life be determined by her anatomy? Why should my son be valued more than my daughter when I love them equally? Or did they accept it as natural, inevitable, just the way things were? We do not have many sources that tell us what ordinary mothers thought. The texts that survive were almost all written by men, but we have hints. We have poetry that celebrates maternal love for daughters as well as sons. We have grave markers where parents mourn daughters with the same intensity they mourned sons. We have myths where mothers fought for their daughters, protected them, grieved when they were taken away. So I think at least some mothers resisted the cultural narrative. At least some mothers looked at their daughters and saw potential and value regardless of what the world said. And they did what they could within the constraints of their powerlessness to help their daughters survive and maybe even thrive. There is a darker side to all of this, though, a consequence of the devaluation of daughters that I think we need to acknowledge. When you grow up knowing that your family sees you as less valuable than your brothers, when you internalize the message that you are a burden rather than a blessing, what does that do to your sense of self? What does it do to your relationships with other women, including your own mother? There must have been daughters who resented their mothers for not protecting them from this, for not standing up to the fathers and brothers and husbands who treated women as property, for participating in a system that oppressed them, even though rationally we know the mothers were victims of the same system, even though they had no power to change things. The emotional reality of being a daughter watching your mother accept her own subordination must have been complicated and painful, and there must have been mothers who, consciously or not, treated their sons better than their daughters, who gave the boys more food, more attention, more affection. Not because they loved their daughters less necessarily, but because they had internalized the cultural values so deeply that they could not help but reproduce them. This is how oppression perpetuates itself, not just through laws and institutions, but through the small daily choices of people who don't even realize they are making those choices. The tuft of wool on the door was not just a symbol, it was a prophecy. It said, this child will be limited, this child will be confined, this child will be traded to another family when she is barely more than a child herself. And more often than not, that prophecy came true. Because how do you fight against an entire system when you have no power and no resources and no support? Some women did fight in their own ways. We have evidence of that. Women who refused to accept the limitations placed on them. Poets like Sappho, who created art that challenged the masculine worldview. Philosophers like Arete of Cyrene, who taught publicly despite the social prohibition against it, priestesses and healers and women who found ways to claim authority within religious contexts. But these were exceptions, rare and remarkable precisely because they were so unusual. For every Sappho, there were thousands of nameless women who spent their lives at the loom, who married young and had too many children and died before they reached 40. Women whose potential was never realized because the tuft of wool on the door had already sealed their fate. Let me tell you about one more thing that I find both heartbreaking and revealing. Sometimes families with multiple daughters would not bother hanging wool on the door at all. Just nothing. No announcement, as if the birth had not even happened. This was particularly common if the family already had 1 or 2 daughters and was desperately hoping for a son. Another daughter was not news. It was not worth announcing. The baby existed, obviously, but publicly acknowledging her existence was not a priority. Can you imagine growing up and learning that when you were born, your family did not even care enough to hang a symbol on the door, that your arrival was met with such disappointment that silence seemed like the best response? And then imagine being the mother of that baby, knowing that your daughter is being erased before her life has even begun. knowing that you cannot protect her from this, that you cannot make the world value her, that all you can do is love her. Privately and hope it is enough. It probably was not enough. Love alone cannot shield you from systematic devaluation. But it was something. It was the only thing mothers had to give. The olive wreath and the tuft of wool were not the only gendered symbols in ancient Greek culture, of course. There were others. Baby boys were bathed in olive oil after birth, connecting them to that sacred tree and all it represented. Baby girls were not. Boys underwent specific religious rituals that welcomed. They entered the civic community. Girls had different rituals that emphasized their future roles as wives and mothers. At every stage of life, the message was reinforced. You are a boy, therefore you are limited. The symbols changed, but the underlying message remained constant, and mothers watched this happen to their daughters. They could not stop it. They could not change it. They could only try to prepare their daughters for it, try to give them the tools. To survive it, try to love them enough that they would not completely break under the weight of it. Sometimes I think about all the daughters who did break, who internalized their worthlessness so deeply that they could not function, who fell into despair or rage or numbness, who went through the motions of their prescribed lives without ever really living. We do not have records of these women because nobody thought their psychological suffering was worth documenting. But they existed. Must have existed. You cannot systematically devalue half the population without causing psychological damage. And I think about the mothers who watched their daughters suffer and felt helpless, who wanted to rage against the system but could not because they would be punished for it, who settled for small acts of love and support because small acts were all they had. The tuft of wool on the door was small too, just a bit of fiber, easily ignored, but it carried so much weight, so much pain. Much resignation, it said. Another girl has been born and we will do our duty by her, but do not expect us to celebrate. Here is what I keep coming back to, though. Despite all of this, despite the devaluation and the limited opportunities and the constant message that they did not matter as much as their brothers, despite all of that, some daughters thrived. Some found ways to claim power and create meaning. Some loved fiercely and lived fully within the constraints they were given. Their mothers who gave birth to them knowing the world would not value them, who saw that tuft of wool on the door and felt the weight of disappointment, who loved their daughters anyway with a kind of defiant tenderness. Those mothers were heroes in their own quiet way. They kept loving when it would have been easier to accept the cultural narrative and hold back. They kept nurturing when the return on investment measured by society's metrics was negative. That is a form of resistance. It may not look like revolution. It may not have overthrown the patriarchy or changed the laws or created new opportunities. But it kept daughters alive, physically and emotionally. It gave them someone who believed in them even when no one else did. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that one person who loves you is what gets you through. In our next part, we're going to turn to something we have been circling around this entire time but have not yet addressed directly. The emotional reality of motherhood in ancient Greece. How did women cope with knowing that half their children would probably die? How did they balance love with the need for self-protection? How did they grieve? How did they hope? How did they find the strength to keep going when loss was so common and death was so close? We're going to talk about the psychology of survival, about the human capacity for resilience in the face of impossible odds. So stay with me. We're nearing the end of our journey, but there is still more to understand. Of all the questions I have wrestled with while putting this series together, this one kept me up at night longer than any other. How do you love your children when you know statistically, when you know from lived experience, from watching your neighbors and your friends and possibly your own previous children, that roughly half of them will not make it to adulthood? How do you do that? How do you open your heart completely to a tiny, fragile person when the world has already shown you repeatedly that opening your heart means accepting the risk of devastating loss? I thought about this for a long time. And I want to share what I found because I think the answer tells us something profound, not just about ancient Greek mothers, but about all of us. Let us start with the numbers one more time because we need them as context. Between 30 and 50% of children born in ancient Greece did not survive to adulthood. Some scholars put the figure higher in certain periods and regions. We also know that the ancient Greeks were aware of this reality. It was not hidden from modern Westerners. Children died in the home, among family members. Parents washed and prepared their children's bodies for burial. Grief was public, visible, communal. So this was not abstract statistical knowledge. It was visceral, embodied knowledge. You'd probably already lost at least one child before you were 30. You had certainly lost siblings or cousins in childhood. Death was not something that happened to other people in other places. It was something that happened in your house, in your family, to people you loved.
And yet, the evidence tells us that parents grieved intensely when their children died. There was no acceptance, no stoic detachment. The tombstone inscriptions we've already seen throughout this series are testimony to that. Parents who ask strangers to weep for their children. Parents who describe their grief as endless, as a wound that will never heal. So the knowledge of probable loss did not prevent deep love, which raises the question, how? I want to tell you about a practice that might seem strange at first, but becomes deeply understandable when you think about it. Ancient Greek parents, particularly mothers, participated in what scholars now call small grief rituals throughout their children's lives, not waiting until death to mourn, but building acknowledgement of mortality into the fabric of everyday life. When a child fell ill, a mother might leave a small offering at a household shrine, not just asking for recovery, but also quietly acknowledging the possibility of loss. When a child had a close call, a fever that broke just in time, a fall that could have been worse, the mother would thank the gods, but also sit with the nearness of what might have been. These small rituals, these regular acknowledgements that life was fragile and children were temporary gifts rather than permanent possessions, might have served a kind of psychological purpose. They kept grief close enough that it was not completely shocking when it arrived. They prevented the kind of total shattering surprise that can make loss unbearable. Modern psychology has a term for a related concept, continuing bonds theory. The idea that healthy grief does not mean severing your emotional connection to someone who has died, but maintaining a transformed relationship with them, keeping them present in your life in a different form. Ancient Greek parents seem to have understood something like this instinctively. The ongoing visits to children's graves, the continued pouring of libations, the way they wrote epitaphs as if their dead children could still speak, all of that was a way of continuing the bond, of keeping the child present even after death. But let me address the central question more directly, because I think the mechanism that allowed ancient Greek mothers to love so deeply despite such odds is actually something very simple and very human. They did not think about the odds, not all the time. Not while they were holding a nursing baby at midnight, or watching a toddler take his first wobbly steps, or listening to a daughter learn to sing. In those moments, they were just mothers, just women in love with their children, just human beings experiencing the particular joy of watching new life figure out how to exist. We have this modern tendency to think that if people knew terrible things were likely, they would be emotionally defended against them. That awareness of probability would translate to emotional distance, but that is not how humans work. We are extraordinarily bad at sustained awareness of future loss. We live in the present, we get swept up in the moment, and that sweeping up, that capacity for full, present-tense love, regardless of future uncertainty, is not a bug in our psychology. It is a feature. It is how we survive. Ancient mothers loved their children the way all mothers love their children, completely in the moment without full awareness of the odds. And then when loss came, they grieved completely too. Both things were true simultaneously. The love and the awareness of fragility, the joy and the grief. Living with that contradiction was not something they solved. It was something they endured day after day, birth after birth, loss after loss. There is a philosophical concept from ancient Greece that I think applies here, though it was usually discussed in male contexts. It is the idea of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or happiness, but really meaning something more like living fully in accordance with your nature and your circumstances. The Stoic philosophers, who came later than classical Greece but built on Greek philosophical traditions, talked about what they called the dichotomy of control. You can only control your own actions and responses. You cannot control outcomes. And therefore the path to peace lies in giving your full effort and full love to what is yours to give, while releasing your grip on what is not yours to control, including whether your children survive. The Stoics did not originate this wisdom. They systematized it. The underlying insight that love does not require certainty of outcome, that you can give everything to something fragile without being destroyed by its fragility. This was lived knowledge in ancient Greece, long before anyone wrote it into philosophical treatises. Ancient Greek mothers practiced a kind of stoicism before stoicism had a name, not because they read philosophy, but because it was the only way to survive. You love your children with everything you have. You do everything in your power to keep them alive. And when that is not enough, when the fever wins, or the infection wins, or the accident wins, you grieve fully, and then you go on, because you have other children who need you, because life continues, demanding your presence even when all you want to do is stop. There is one specific piece of evidence I want to share with you because it has stayed with me more than almost anything else I encountered in researching this series.
It is not a tombstone inscription. It is not a fragment of philosophy. It is a simple physical object. Archaeologists excavating grave sites throughout ancient Greece have found in children's graves small toys, clay horses, dolls with articulated limbs, miniature kitchen sets, board games, rattles for babies. These were buried, with the children placed in the grave by their parents to accompany them into whatever came after death, to make sure that wherever they went they would have something familiar, something loved, something that connected them to the life they had left. Parents who are emotionally detached from their children do not bury toys with them. Parents who are protecting themselves from grief by holding back love do not carefully choose a favorite plaything to send with a dead child into eternity. Those toys are evidence of complete, unguarded, devastating love. The kind of love that keeps loving even when the person is gone. The kind of love that wants to make sure even the dead are comfortable. That is not a love shaped by probability or tempered by awareness of mortality. That is just love, pure and simple and heartbreaking in its completeness. I want to talk for a moment about something that the ancient sources do not address directly, but that I believe was a significant part of how mothers coped, and that is the way they talked to each other about their losses. We have talked about the Thesmophoria, the festival where women came together in their own space, away from men, to grieve and laugh and rage and pray. But the Thesmophoria happened once a year. What happened the rest of the time? I believe women created informal networks of grief support that were woven into the fabric of everyday life. When you went to the public well to draw water, you talked to other women. You visited female friends and relatives, you talked. When you sat weaving in the Gynaecon, you talked. And what women talk about across all cultures and all centuries is their children. Their worries about their children, their losses. There is a fragment of a Greek comedy, now largely lost, that refers to women gathering to gossip. In ancient Greek, the word used is lalia, meaning chatter or talk. The male author clearly means it dismissively, but I want to reclaim it because that chatter, that talk, was how women processed their lives, how they made sense of their experiences, how they supported each other through loss. When your child died, your neighbor came. Not just because it was socially expected, because she understood, because she would probably lose a child too, because there was nothing she could say that would fix it, but being present, being another body in the room that understood grief, mattered enormously. This is the thing about community that we have lost. In modern, atomized, individualistic society, the idea that grief is not private, that it belongs to the community, that when one mother loses a child, all the mothers feel it. And that feeling, that collective acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, is a form of support that no therapy or medication or support group quite replicates. Ancient Greek women grieved publicly, loudly, together. They tore their clothes, they beat their breasts, they wailed without restraint, and then eventually they returned to life because they had witnessed each other's grief and they had survived. And survival witnessed by others who understood the cost was its own form of hope. What did ancient Greek mothers actually hope for when they prayed to Eileithyia and dedicated their belts to Artemis and sat in the Thesmophoria and buried toys with their dead children? What were they ultimately hoping for? They hoped for the ordinary, for their children to grow up, to grow tall and strong and capable, to marry, and have children of their own, to be there to help when the next birth came, the way their own mothers had been there for them. To sit together in old age and count the grandchildren and feel for a moment that the world was good and life was worth all the pain it had cost. They hoped for nothing extraordinary, no fame or glory or historical legacy, just the continuation of life, the extension of love through generations, the chain of mothers and daughters going forward into a future they would never see. And most of them did not get that simple hope fulfilled. Most of them lost children along the way. Most of them died before they were old enough to count grandchildren in the sunlight. Most of them were forgotten within a generation or two, their names fading from memory, their stories untold. But they hoped anyway. Every single birth, every single child accepted into the family, every small clay horse tucked beside the dead child in a grave, every prayer whispered to Eileithyia, every belt loosened and later dedicated. Every tear shed in community with other women who understood. All of it was an expression of hope. Stubborn, irrational, completely human hope. And in the end, enough of it came true. Enough mothers survived. Enough children grew up. Enough love was transmitted across generations to eventually produce us, sitting here in our comfortable present, astonished and moved by the lives of women who lived and loved and hoped 2,500 years ago. In our final part, we're going to bring all of this together. We're going to talk about legacy, about what survives, about what these ancient mothers have left us. Not in monuments or texts, but in something far more durable. in the patterns of love and resilience and community that still echo in how we care for mothers today. So come with me for one last chapter of this remarkable story. We have traveled a long road together through the shadows of ancient Greece. We have seen 13-year-old brides married to men twice their age. We have watched women gamble their lives 6, 7, 8 times in the deadly lottery of childbirth. We have stood outside doors marked with olive wreaths and tufts of wool. We have witnessed fathers deciding which babies would live and which would be left to die. We have sat with women during their 40 days of isolation, and we've celebrated with them during the thesmophoria when they reclaimed a small piece of power. But there is one question we have not fully answered yet, the biggest question of all. How did mothers in ancient Greece actually do it? How did they love their children knowing that so many of them would die? How did they keep their hearts open when every pregnancy was a risk and every childhood illness could be fatal? How did they survive emotionally in a world where loss was not an occasional tragedy, but an expected part of life? This is what I want to explore with you now in these final moments. Not statistics or the rituals or the social structures, but the human heart at the center of it all. Because that is what endures. That is what connects us across 2,500 years. The love of a mother for her child, the grief when that child is lost, the courage it takes to love again. Anyway, let me start with a number that should be seared into your brain by now. Between 30 and 50% of children born in ancient Greece did not survive to adulthood. 1 in 3, 1 in 2. Those are not abstract statistics. When you are a mother, those are your babies, your toddlers, your children who you watch learn to walk and talk and laugh. Half of them gone. Some died in infancy. Some died from childhood diseases we can easily cure today. Measles, pneumonia, diarrheal illnesses that led to fatal dehydration. Some died from accidents, falls, drownings, burns from cooking fires. Some died from the practice of exposure that we talked about earlier. Some died for reasons nobody understood, babies who just stopped thriving and faded away. And mothers watched it happen over and over. You would have 6 children and 3 might make it to adulthood. You would pour your love and care into all of them, knowing that the odds were against you keeping them all. Knowing that before you were done raising your family, you would probably bury at least 2 or 3 of your babies. How do you do that? How do you emotionally prepare yourself for that level of loss? The answer, I think, is that you cannot. You cannot prepare for it. You cannot armor your heart enough to make it not hurt. And the ancient Greeks knew this. Their literature is full of grieving mothers. Their graveyards are full of tiny graves with heartbreaking inscriptions. The archaeological record tells us that families mourned their dead children with grave offerings and rituals and poetry. So the idea that ancient people were somehow more accepting of child death, that they did not love their children, as much as we do because death was so common, is completely wrong. They grieved. They grieved deeply and genuinely and in ways that tore them apart. There is a fragment of poetry, author unknown, that was found carved on a child's gravestone. It says, "I, Phila, lie here dead at 5 years old. My mother and father set up this monument for me. Weep when you pass, stranger, for my short life and my parents' grief." 5 years old. The parents had this child for 5 years. They watched her grow. From infant to toddler to little girl. They heard her voice, her laughter. They saw her personality developing. And then she died. And they were so devastated that they paid for a stone marker and asked strangers, people who would never know Phila, to weep for her. That is not acceptance. That is profound grief. That is a wound that will never fully heal. There are hundreds of inscriptions like this. Thousands probably, though many have been lost. Parents recording their children's names there. Ages, sometimes details about how they died or what they were like in life. Making sure that someone somewhere would remember that this child existed, that their short life mattered. And here is what gets me. These inscriptions were often written in the voice of the child, as if the dead child was speaking. "I was only 8 when I died. I left my mother and father weeping. Remember me, traveler, and pour a libation for my shade." Why that choice? Why speak as the dead child rather than as grieving parent? I think it is because the parents could not bear to speak in their own voices, could not put their grief into first person. It was too raw, too overwhelming. So they let the child speak instead. They imagined what the child would say if they could, and somehow that was more bearable than saying, "We lost our daughter," or "Our son is dead." But here is the thing. Despite the grief, despite the high rates of child mortality, mothers kept having children. They kept loving them. They kept investing emotionally, even when logic might suggest that holding back, protecting yourself would be safer. There is a line from Sophocles that I mentioned way back at the beginning of our journey. He wrote, "Children are the anchors of a mother's life, not living children, not children who survive to adulthood, just children." The relationship, the bond, the love itself was the anchor, regardless of how long it lasted. And Euripides wrote, "There is no love anywhere that could be sweeter than this." The love between mother and child, again, no qualifiers, no if the child survives or as long as they are healthy. The love itself in its existence was the sweetest thing. These playwrights were men, not mothers, but they were writing for audiences that included mothers, and the lines resonated because they captured something true about the maternal experience. You love your children not because they are guaranteed to survive, not because the investment will pay off, but because they are yours and you cannot help it. That is both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because it shows the power of human connection, the way love can exist independently of outcome or reward. Terrible because it means mothers were setting themselves up for heartbreak over and over, and knowing they were doing it, and doing it anyway because there was no alternative. I think there are a few things that helped ancient Greek mothers survive this emotional gauntlet.
Not solve it, not.
Make it okay, but survive it. First, community.
We've talked about this throughout our journey.
The female kinship networks, the support of other women who had been through the same losses. When your child died, you were not alone in your grief. There were other mothers who understood, who could sit with you in silence because words were inadequate, who could tell you, "I lost a child too. I know this pain. You will survive it, even though right now it feels like you cannot." That shared experience mattered. It did not make the grief less, but it made it more bearable because it was witnessed and validated by others who knew. Second, ritual. The Greeks had elaborate funeral rituals for children.
The body would be washed and anointed.
Coins would be placed on the eyes to pay the ferryman who carried souls across the river to the underworld. There would be mourning, wailing, the tearing of clothes, the burial itself with grave offerings, and then ongoing rituals. Visits to the grave, libations poured for the dead child's shade. These rituals gave structure to grief. They gave you something to do with your hands and your body when your mind and heart were too shattered to function. They were a way of honoring the child, of saying, this life mattered even though it was short. And they connected you to generations of parents who had done the same rituals for their lost children, creating a sense of continuity and tradition. Third, and this might sound strange, but I think the certainty of loss was almost easier to deal with than uncertainty would have been. When child death is rare and unexpected, when most children survive, losing a child feels like a cosmic injustice, like the universe singled you out for tragedy. But when child death is common, when every mother you know has lost at least one child, it feels more like a shared burden of human existence. Not fair, certainly, but not a punishment aimed specifically at you. I am not saying this made it. Okay, but it might have made it slightly more survivable. You are not alone in your loss. You are part of a sad sisterhood of mothers who understood. There is one more aspect of this that I want to address, and it is the most speculative, but I think it might be the most important. I believe that ancient Greek mothers found ways to celebrate and honor the time they had with their children, rather than only mourning the time they lost. We see hints of this in the literature. In Homer, when Hector is about to go fight Achilles and almost certainly die, he says goodbye to his infant son. He picks him up, kisses him, prays to the gods that his son will grow up to be even greater than his father. It is a moment of pure love and hope, even though both Hector and we as readers know that he is about to die and this baby will grow up fatherless. The scene is tragic, but it is also tender. Hector is not withholding his love because the future is uncertain. He is giving all his love right now, in. This moment is all he has. I think mothers did something similar. They loved their children fiercely while they had them. They celebrated the small milestones, the first smile, the first word, the first steps. They told stories and sang songs and held their babies close. And if the child died, they mourned. But they also had those memories, those moments of pure joy and connection that death could not erase. There is a modern concept in psychology called anticipatory grief, a loss before it happens because you know it is coming. I wondered earlier if ancient Greek mothers experienced this, if they held back emotionally from their children to protect themselves. But I do not think they did, or at least I do not think that was the dominant pattern. Because if you hold back, if you protect yourself by not fully loving, then you lose twice. You lose the child when they die, and you lose the relationship you could have had with them. While they were alive, you rob yourself of the very thing that makes the pain worthwhile. So I think most mothers chose to love fully, to embrace the joy along with the grief, to understand that both were part of the package and you could not have one without risking the other. That is courage. That is what I find most awe-inspiring about ancient Greek mothers. Not that they survived childbirth, though that took courage too. Not that they bore so many children, though that was its own form of but that they kept loving, they kept opening their hearts, they kept finding joy in their children, even when they knew statistically that some of those children would not survive. Let me bring this back to something concrete, something specific, because I do not want to end in abstraction. I want to end with a person, a real mother who lived and loved and lost, and whose story survived. Her name is not recorded, which is typical, but her grief is there. There is an inscription on her child's tomb that says, "This is the grave of Charit. She died at age 7. Her mother set up this stone and weeps for her daily. Stranger, if you are a parent, you know this pain. If you are not, may you never learn it." That last line destroys me. May you never learn it. The mother is not just grieving. She is warning. She is saying to every person who passes by, this is the worst pain imaginable. If you have felt it, you understand. If you have not, consider yourself fortunate and hope. But here is the thing. That mother, that unnamed woman who lost Charit at age 7, she survived. She kept living. She did not die of grief, even though part of her probably wanted to. She got up every day and went through the motions of her life. She probably had other children who needed her. She probably had a household to run, responsibilities that did not pause for her pain. And she came to Charity's grave daily to weep. She kept that connection alive. She kept loving her daughter, even though her daughter was dead. That is what mothers do. They keep loving even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. So what do we learn from all of this? What does the story of motherhood in ancient Greece teach us about ourselves, about human nature, about love and loss and survival? I think it teaches us that the fundamentals of the human heart do not change. Technology changes, social structures change, medical knowledge advances, but the love of a mother for her child. Grief when that child is lost, the courage it takes to keep going anyway, those things are eternal. They connect us across millennia. The women we've been talking about lived 2,500 years ago in a world that was vastly different from ours. But they felt what we feel. They loved as we love. They suffered as we suffer. And they survived. Because humans are remarkably good at surviving, even when it seems impossible. We also learn, I think, that resilience is not the same as acceptance. Ancient Greek mothers were resilient. They survived impossible circumstances. But that does not mean they thought those circumstances were okay. It does not mean they were not angry or sad or scared. It does not mean they would not have changed things if they could. Celebrating their strength does not require us to romanticize their suffering. We can honor their courage while also acknowledging that the system was brutal and unjust, that women deserved better, that children deserved, that the high rates of maternal and infant mortality were not inevitable natural disasters, but were the result of specific social choices about how to value women's lives and bodies. And maybe, just maybe, we can look at our own world with fresh eyes. Because while we have made tremendous progress in some areas, we still have societies where maternal mortality is shockingly high, where women do not have access to reproductive health care, where daughters are valued less than sons, where mothers are expected to sacrifice everything for their children while receiving little support in return. The specifics have changed, but the underlying issues, the way societies use and devalue women's bodies, those patterns persist. And maybe understanding the past can help us see the present more clearly, can help us ask better questions about what we owe mothers, what we owe children, what a truly just society would look like. I want to end with gratitude. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for sitting with the difficult stories, the sad statistics, the moments of darkness. It has not been an easy ride. Motherhood in ancient Greece was hard, and I have not shied away from showing you just how hard it was. But I hope you've also seen the light, the moments of joy and connection and solidarity, the rituals that brought women together, the myths that validated their experiences, the fierce, stubborn love that persisted despite everything. Those ancient mothers, whose names we mostly do not know, whose voices are mostly lost to history, they deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told honestly and completely, not as saints or victims, but as fully human, as women who made choices within constraints, who loved and grieved and survived as best they could. They are part of your story too, if you trace your ancestry back far enough. They are part of the great chain of mothers and daughters that stretches back to the beginning of human history, and their strength, their resilience, their capacity for love in the face of loss that lives on in all of us. So tonight, as you are drifting off to sleep, maybe think about them for a moment. Those ancient mothers sitting up with crying babies. Those women supporting each other through childbirth and grief. Those girls who became mothers far too young and somehow found the courage to keep going. They are reaching across the centuries to hold your hand, to remind you that you are not alone, that women have always survived impossible things. That love has always been stronger than fear. that the human spirit, especially the maternal spirit, is more resilient than we can possibly imagine. Sleep well, friends. And when you wake up, remember that you too are part of this story. That the courage and love of those ancient mothers flows through you. That their legacy is yours to carry forward. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these forgotten women and giving them space in your hearts and minds. There are more stories waiting to be told, more voices from the past calling out to be heard. I will be here when you're ready to listen again. Until then, rest well and remember, you are stronger than you know, just like they were. Good night, sweet dreams.